My boyfriend's secret double life, found out through a random phone call. I never expected a simple phone call to unravel the life I thought I knew. My name is Anna, and I'm in my late 20s. I've been with my boyfriend, Mike, for almost 2 years. When we first met at a mutual friend's party, I was instantly drawn to his charm and wit. He was everything I ever wanted in a partner: kind, ambitious, and a little mysterious. We spent countless nights laughing and dreaming about our future, building a life together that felt solid and secure. One evening, while Mike was working late, I found myself curled up on the couch with a glass of wine, scrolling through social media. It was a typical night. I thought I'd call it an early night when my phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number. My heart raced. I hesitated but answered. "Hello?" I said, a little unsure. "Is this Anna?" The voice on the other end was distorted, sounding panicked. Yes. Who is this?" There was a pause, and then the voice rushed, "You need to listen to me." "Is Mike there?" "He's in trouble." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean? Who are you?" "I can't explain right now. Just. He's not who you think he is. He's in danger. You need to find him." Before I could respond, the call dropped. I stared at my phone, bewildered. My mind raced with confusion. I brushed it off as a prank or a wrong number, but the seed of doubt was planted deep in my thoughts. The next few days were filled with strange occurrences. Mike continued to work late, but his stories started to feel inconsistent. One evening, he claimed he was finishing up a project, but his texts came in erratically. I found it odd that he'd leave his phone unlocked, revealing a few odd messages from contacts I didn't recognize. I was starting to feel uneasy. Mike's behavior became more distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. A few nights later, I was lying in bed next to him, unable to sleep. I decided to investigate. I quietly grabbed his phone from the nightstand and scrolled through his messages. Most were mundane, but one stood out: "We need to meet. It's urgent." The name attached to the message was unfamiliar. Panic surged through me. What was going on? My heart raced as I put his phone back and tried to act normal when he stirred next to me. The next day, I took it a step further. I started checking his social media. His profile seemed pristine, almost too perfect. Nothing out of the ordinary. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I needed to know the truth, so I went to a few of Mike's friends, casually asking about him. They all had nice things to say, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were hiding something. I finally decided to confront him. "Mike," I said one evening as he walked in from work, "I need to talk to you about something." He looked concerned, setting his bag down. "Sure, what's up? Is there something you're not telling me?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "I got a strange phone call the other night. Someone said you were in trouble." He frowned, crossing his arms. "That's ridiculous. I'm fine. You shouldn't listen to random callers." "But I found some messages on your phone," I pressed, feeling the anger bubbling up. "And your stories haven't added up." Mike's face shifted from confusion to something darker. "Anna, you need to drop this. It's nothing. I promise." His reaction only fueled my determination. I decided to dig deeper. A week passed, and my paranoia intensified. Then, late one night, I received another call from the same unknown number. My heart raced as I answered. "Anna." The voice was clearer this time, but still distorted. "You need to get out. Mike is not who you think he is. He has a past, a dangerous one. He's been lying to you." I felt my stomach drop. "What do you mean?" "I can't explain everything over the phone, but you need to trust me. He's in trouble with people who want him dead. They're looking for him. And they'll come for you too if they find out you're with him." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I was shaking as I hung up. My mind raced with fear and confusion. Mike had never mentioned anything about his past. What had I gotten myself into? The next day, I confronted him again. I spoke to that caller. "I need you to tell me the truth. Who are you, Mike?" He looked shocked, almost frightened. "Anna, please. You have to trust me. I left that life behind. I thought I could start fresh with you. But you're in danger, aren't you?" I pressed. What kind of danger? He hesitated, his expression flickering between guilt and desperation. It's complicated. I can't go into details, but there are people who want revenge. I've tried to protect you, but now I don't know if I can. Just then, a loud noise interrupted our conversation. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I felt a surge of panic as Mike's eyes widened. Anna, you have to listen to me. We need to leave. Now. My heart raced. What's happening? He grabbed my hand, pulling me towards the door. I'll explain everything later, but you have to trust me. As we reached the door, the phone rang again, the screen lighting up with the unknown number. I froze, torn between answering and fleeing. Mike was tugging me to go, but I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Anna, answer it. It could be important, he shouted. I glanced at the phone, the urge to know pulling me in both directions. With a shaky breath, I answered, my voice trembling. Hello? Anna. Listen carefully. You need to get away from him. He's not the man you think he is. Panic washed over me as Mike's grip tightened on my arm. I looked into his eyes, searching for reassurance, but all I saw was fear. Who are you? I demanded, my voice breaking. I can't explain right now, but you need to trust me. He's dangerous. Run. Before I could respond, Mike yanked the phone from my hand and ended the call. Anna, we don't have time for this. The sirens were almost upon us, and a sense of urgency flooded the air. I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions, fear, love, betrayal. Please, just tell me the truth, I cried out, desperate for answers. Just trust me. We can get away, and I'll explain everything. But in that moment, I realized I didn't know who to trust. The sirens echoed around us, growing louder, and I was left standing at the crossroads of love and survival, wondering if I'd ever truly known the man I loved. As I looked into Mike's eyes, I was struck by the uncertainty of it all. Would I run with him into the unknown, or would I stand my ground and face whatever awaited me? I had a choice to make, and it would change everything. In that moment of hesitation, I knew one thing: whatever path I chose, I would never see my life the same way again. I want to tell you about the time I joined a fitness class and found a community, though calling it a community might be misleading, considering the events that transpired. It all started when I resolved to kick my sedentary lifestyle in the new year. The resolution wasn't just for my health, it was a desperate plea to feel alive again. I stumbled upon a high-intensity interval training class at a local gym. The reviews were glowing, people raved about the instructors, and the overall atmosphere seemed vibrant and encouraging. I signed up on a whim, fueled by a desire to transform myself and perhaps meet new friends. On the first day, I pushed open the glass door, and a bell chimed as I stepped inside. The smell of sweat and determination filled the air, mingled with a hint of something metallic that I couldn't quite place. A tall woman with arms like carved marble invited me to join the class, her voice booming yet warm. She introduced herself as Coach Lisa, and the other participants followed suit, each more welcoming than the last. I felt a flicker of hope as I joined the group, mostly people in their late 20s to early 40s, with smiles hinting at camaraderie. As the class kicked off, I struggled to keep up, my muscles screaming as I pushed through squats and burpees. But the atmosphere was infectious. Each participant cheered for one another, offering high fives and laughter, even when someone fell behind. There was a camaraderie that was hard to ignore, an unspoken bond forming between us. Week after week, I returned, slowly building my strength and discovering a rhythm I never knew I had. There was a beauty to the struggle. I started to connect with the people in the class. We shared our stories, our fears, and our victories, forging something deeper than just an exercise bond. It became a sanctuary after the chaos of the outside world. This was more than fitness, it was a community. But then, about a month in, things began to change. Coach Lisa, who had been our enthusiastic cheerleader, started pushing us harder, demanding more and more each session. At first, we welcomed the challenge. After all, growth comes from discomfort, right? But I noticed something off, a twitch in her eye, a serrated edge to her encouragement that sent chills down my spine. During one class, someone collapsed, gasping for air. I rushed over, and Coach Lisa ordered us to keep going, her voice cutting through the commotion like a knife. Confusion engulfed the room until the paramedics arrived, and the shrill sirens filled the air. The woman who collapsed, easily in her 30s, was taken away. The rest of us filed outside, shaken, uncertain about the day's events. I drove home, processing my thoughts, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow. When class resumed, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations turned quiet, laughter faded, and each of us carried the weight of that day with us. It wasn't just a fitness class anymore, it felt like we had become part of something darker, the camaraderie giving way to anxiety. Despite this, each of us returned. Surprisingly, we were drawn back into the cycle, our minds whispering that if we pushed harder, we'd find the community we had once cherished. One evening, I overheard two classmates speaking in hushed tones. They mentioned strange symbols that Coach Lisa often drew when we suffered through particularly grueling workouts. My heart raced. I hadn't noticed these markings before, but now they felt like they were etched into my memory. Upon further investigation, I discovered online forums filled with stories of other fitness classes that had devolved into cult-like structures, with instructors who manipulated their followers into extreme dedication. In a fit of despair, I rewatched old footage from our sessions, and what I saw was chilling. Behind the smiles, there was a growing intensity in Lisa's gaze, a predatory energy that thrived on our exhaustion. One Saturday evening, we had a workout scheduled that was reportedly a culmination session whatever that meant. I arrived, but when I opened the door, the atmosphere was thick with tension. No one spoke, and the lights dimmed, casting strange shadows across the room. As we lined up, Lisa entered, and her demeanor had shifted, more erratic and frenzied than ever before. I felt a desire to leave but was frozen in place, unable to move. She began chanting, drawing those symbols in the air with her fingers, an incantation that felt alien yet alluring. The room pulsed, breathing together as if we were part of something bigger, something cosmic. Despite my instincts screaming to flee, I couldn't shake the feeling of belonging, that perhaps this was where I was meant to be, pulled in by that magnetic force. It all unraveled in a cacophony of voices, as we entered a trance-like state, moving rhythmically, endlessly, our bodies dripping with sweat as we surrendered ourselves to what Lisa demanded. I could feel the collective exhilaration, but beneath it was a dread that gnawed at my gut. Just as I thought I might lose myself entirely, a loud crash broke the tension, a window shattered, and a figure rushed inside. It was Eric, one of our more rational members, eyes wild with fear. "Get out," he shouted, but before he could reach me, two others seized him and dragged him away, their eyes glazed, lost to the haze of the class. Panic surged through me, and with every ounce of strength, I bolted for the door, navigating through the confusion as bodies twitched and swayed. I sprinted into the night, and as I looked back, I saw the group converging around Lisa, calling out her name, their voices merging into a chorus of chants. The relief of cold air hit me hard as I stumbled into my car. I drove off, heart racing, desperate to distance myself from that nightmare that had masqueraded as a community. Weeks went by without contact. I found another gym and resumed my normal life, but I could still hear their chants echoing in my mind. I wondered what had happened to those men and women I'd shared laughter and sweat with, and whether any of them had managed to escape. I later heard whispers about Lisa, how she had vanished, taking her followers with her to an unnamed location. Those who sought to leave reportedly met disturbing ends, as if the ties that bound them were stronger than their will to break free. I shuddered at the thought of it all, my heart heavy with guilt and loss for what we had once shared, a sense of belonging twisted into something insidious. I look at my reflection in the mirror every day, challenging myself to remember what it meant to be part of a community but haunted by the specters of a past I can't escape. I still work out, try out new classes, but each time I walk into a gym, the taste of that metallic fear creeps back in, reminding me that sometimes, the things we join with the best of intentions can lead to places darker than we ever imagined. So please, if you're thinking of trying something new or joining a community, take a step back. Make sure you're stepping into a place built on trust and love, not one that could swallow you whole. When I discovered the joy of minimalism, it was out of necessity rather than choice. My life had spiraled into chaos, each possession suffocating me with an overwhelming weight of expectations and burdens. It wasn't just physical clutter, it was emotional baggage too. I was stuck in a dead-end job, surrounded by toxic relationships, and lost in a whirlwind of self-deprecation. It all came to a head one fateful evening when I stumbled upon an old box in my attic, covered in dust and forgotten memories. Intrigued, I dragged it down to my living room, where the dim light cast eerie shadows on the walls. As I opened the box, I was hit with a wave of nostalgia, yet instead of joy, a heavy sense of dread washed over me. Inside were remnants of my childhood, stuffed animals, broken toys, old journals with pages yellowing and curled at the edges. The weight of those memories pressed down on me, suffocating my breath. Why had I kept all of this? I felt an overwhelming need to purge. That night, I began the daunting process of decluttering my life, a journey that I would never have expected to lead me to clarity. With each item I packed into garbage bags, tossing out toys from a past I had outgrown and clothing that no longer fit me, both physically and metaphorically, there was a strange liberation. I felt lighter with each discard, but I also began to realize how entrenched my identity was in these objects. I wasn't just shedding possessions, I was shedding layers of myself, questioning who I was without the things I had surrounded myself with. Sleepless nights turned into dawns filled with contemplation. I started to pare down not just my belongings, but my connections too. I cut ties with the friends who brought nothing but negativity into my life. It was a painful but necessary step. I slowly embraced solitude. But in this newfound isolation, I discovered pockets of peace I had long forgotten, the sounds of a distant train, the rustling leaves outside my window. In the quiet, I began to find my voice. Days turned into weeks, and my home transformed from a chaotic mess into a sanctuary. But alongside that transformation, I began to sense an insidious change in my surroundings, a creeping presence that I couldn't quite place. It started with subtlety, flickering lights, small objects disappearing, and reappearing in places I could have sworn I never left them. At first, I laughed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, a product of my anxiety. Yet, as the days wore on, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was not alone in my home. The minimalism that had once brought me joy began to feel eerie, as if everything I discarded had taken on a life of its own, haunting the empty spaces left behind. One night, as I prepared for bed, I heard it, whispers, soft and melodic, almost playful. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination, perhaps a remnant of memories echoing through the halls. But when the whispers turned into distinct phrases, "Let go, join us," I sat bolt upright in my bed, heart racing. I was terrified but also strangely captivated. I couldn't shake the feeling that the very act of letting go had invited something unexplainable into my life, a collective voice of all the items I'd parted with. The more I embraced minimalism, the more I felt these entities drawn to me. I could sometimes glimpse them in the corner of my eye, shadows darting into the dark alcoves of my home. I started keeping a journal, recording each strange occurrence, convinced there had to be some explanation for it all. The journal soon morphed into a narrative of its own, detailing the shift within myself and the haunting presence surrounding me. What I didn't expect was for the journal to reveal myself, my fears, my regrets, my desire for connection. I realized I had replaced physical clutter with an emotional abyss. As I turned the pages, I began to confront the darkness that had ballooned within me, the insecurities that I had buried under the guise of minimalism. It all came crashing down one stormy night, the wind howling outside like a banshee desperate for entry. I was overwhelmed with despair, feeling as if I would never truly free myself from this monstrous weight. Suddenly, I felt a touch, a cool caress grazing my shoulder. I jumped, spinning around, but there was nothing there. In that moment, the whispers crescendoed into an almost melodic chant, filling the room and wrapping around me like a fog, no longer menacing, but strangely comforting. I felt my heart slow, the fear evaporating as an unmistakable warmth enveloped me. I closed my eyes and let the sensations wash over me, surrendering to the experience. In that instant, I understood, these entities weren't there to haunt me, they were guiding me. With newfound clarity, I began to piece together the fragments of myself I had neglected for so long, addressing the vulnerabilities I had stuffed down beneath the surface. It was terrifying but also exhilarating. The minimalism I had embraced was not merely about the items I let go, it was about releasing the fears that clogged my heart and held me captive. I saw how much pride I had placed in objects, and how they no longer defined me. The following weeks brought tremendous healing, and while the whispers remained, I learned to listen to them, finding comfort rather than fear. They became my allies, reminding me of the importance of balance, a relationship with both things and nothingness in harmony. When I finally finished my journal, I decided to share my story online, feeling that maybe, just maybe, it would resonate with someone else. What began as a simple post turned into a phenomenon, a community rallying around shared experiences of decluttering not just possessions but emotional wounds too. People began to share their discoveries, and in that exchange, I found a collective healing. As my journey of minimalism continued, I recognized that the whispers, once a frightening presence, had transformed into a celebration of my newfound lease on life. The joy of minimalism, I discovered, extended far beyond the tangible. It was about embracing the beauty of simplicity, acknowledging the pain of loss, and paving the way for love and connection, not just with others, but with myself. It's been 2 years since that night in my attic, a lifetime in transformation, and I've learned to walk with those whispers, not as ghosts of my past but as reminders of my ongoing journey to a simpler, more meaningful life. The community that blossomed from my vulnerability has continued, and every day, I am reminded that sometimes, the things we think we want to discard are simply waiting to be turned into treasures again, an entirely different perspective on what it means to live fully and authentically. When my neighbor's secret came to light, a shocking revelation. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning, the kind where the world seems to slow down just enough to give you a moment of peace. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft glow across my neighborhood, and I was out on my porch, sipping my coffee and enjoying the stillness. My neighbor, Mr. Anderson, was out too, tending to his garden like he did every weekend. I had lived next door to him for years, and he had always been a quiet, reserved man, someone who kept to himself but was polite when we did speak. He was in his late 60s, with a neat beard and glasses that made him look like the kind of person you'd find lost in a book. He was the kind of neighbor you didn't think twice about, the type you saw occasionally when you passed by but never really got to know. To be honest, I never gave him much thought until that morning. I don't know why, but there was something about him that day that seemed off. As I sat on my porch, I noticed that he was moving in a way that seemed a little too hurried, like he was trying to hide something. Normally, he took his time with his plants, adjusting the soil, making sure everything was in its place, but today he was acting strangely, glancing over his shoulder, quick movements, like he was trying to avoid being seen. I couldn't help but watch him for a few minutes, trying to figure out what was going on. He wasn't even looking at his garden anymore. He was more focused on something near the back of his house, a small shed that I had never really paid attention to before. It was tucked away at the corner of his property, hidden by overgrown bushes, but that morning, it stood out like a shadow in the light. He seemed to be watching it, waiting for something, and that's when I saw it, a car pull up to his driveway. I wasn't expecting visitors. The car was black, sleek, and unfamiliar. It parked at the end of his driveway, and out stepped a woman. She was tall, with dark hair, and she walked towards the back of his house with purpose. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I saw Mr. Anderson's reaction. His eyes went wide when he saw her. He immediately stood up straight and looked around nervously, like he didn't want anyone to see her. I should have looked away, pretended I didn't notice, but something about the situation felt wrong. The woman knocked on the back door of the shed, and after a few seconds, Mr. Anderson opened it just enough to let her inside. They spoke briefly, and then the door shut behind them. I could still see Mr. Anderson's figure through a small crack in the shed's window. His posture was tense, almost as if he was trying to keep something hidden from the outside world. I had never seen him act this way, and it made me feel uneasy. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence, but something inside me told me that this wasn't normal. After about an hour, the woman left. She didn't say anything to Mr. Anderson as she walked back to her car. She just got in, drove off, and disappeared down the road. Mr. Anderson stayed in the shed for a while longer, then finally came out and began cleaning up his garden as if nothing had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was going on in that shed? Why did he act so paranoid when the woman showed up? I decided to let it go for the day, but my curiosity gnawed at me. The next few days were quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I saw Mr. Anderson in his garden, I noticed how he would glance over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to show up again. It was strange, like he was waiting for a call, or maybe trying to avoid being seen. One evening, I was walking my dog around the neighborhood when I noticed something strange. The shed door was slightly ajar. The overgrown bushes had been trimmed back, and I could clearly see inside. Without thinking, I walked closer, my heart pounding in my chest. I was taking a huge risk. Mr. Anderson would never forgive me if he caught me snooping, but I couldn't help it. My feet moved on their own, and I found myself standing in front of the shed, looking inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't just a shed. There was a table in the center, covered in what looked like maps, papers, and old photographs. They were spread out in a haphazard way, as if someone had been working on them in a rush. There were other objects too, strange tools I didn't recognize, and a locked chest sitting in the corner. But the most disturbing thing was the wall behind the table. There were large pieces of paper pinned to it, all marked with dates, names, and locations. Some of the names were crossed out, but others were highlighted in bright red, like someone was keeping track of people. I stepped back in shock, my heart racing. What was this? Was Mr. Anderson involved in something illegal? Something dangerous? I couldn't make sense of it. I had to know more, but I knew I couldn't go any further without risking being caught. I quickly left the area, my mind racing. I spent the rest of the night trying to piece together what I had seen, but nothing made sense. The next day, I decided to do some research. I went online, trying to dig up anything I could about Mr. Anderson. His name was common enough that I didn't find anything immediately, but I did stumble across something that caught my eye, an old news article from about 20 years ago. It was about a missing person case. A young woman had vanished without a trace, and the investigation had gone cold after several months. The woman's name was on one of the papers I had seen pinned to the shed's wall. I froze. Could it be? Was it possible that Mr. Anderson had something to do with the disappearance? I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence seemed to be pointing in that direction. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found. I was watching Mr. Anderson more closely now, noticing every small detail about his behavior. It wasn't just paranoia anymore, it was fear. He was afraid of something, and whatever it was, it had to do with those papers in the shed. I knew I had to confront him, but I didn't know how to even begin. Then, one night, everything changed. I was walking my dog when I saw a shadow move across Mr. Anderson's living room window. The lights were off, but there was enough moonlight for me to see that someone was in his house. My heart raced as I realized that I wasn't the only one watching him. I quickly rushed home, grabbed my phone, and called the police. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I couldn't just stand by anymore. By the time the officers arrived, the shadow had vanished. Mr. Anderson was nowhere to be found, and the house was eerily quiet. The police searched the premises but found no signs of a break-in or anything unusual. They questioned me, but I couldn't provide much information other than what I had seen in the shed. They left, telling me there was nothing they could do unless I had more concrete evidence. The next morning, I woke up to a note on my doorstep. It was from Mr. Anderson. "I know you've been watching me," it read. "You don't understand what's at stake, but you'll learn soon enough. Leave it alone, or you'll regret it." My hands shook as I read the words. What had I gotten myself into? What was the secret Mr. Anderson was hiding, and why did he think I needed to stay away? I don't know what to do now. I feel like I'm on the edge of something much bigger than I ever expected. Something darker. And I don't know if I can walk away from it now. I turned down a promotion and regretted it, here's why. Here's why. It was a decision I thought I'd never make. I'd worked hard for years, climbing the ladder at the company, sacrificing weekends, late nights, even parts of my personal life just to get ahead. So when my boss finally offered me that long-awaited promotion, the one I'd been dreaming of, I shocked even myself by saying, no. It wasn't impulsive, or at least it didn't feel that way. It was months of grueling work, the stress, and this voice in my head warning me that taking on more might actually lead me further from the life I wanted. And honestly, at that moment, I'd convinced myself that my refusal was about setting boundaries, about having more time to focus on my relationship with Mia, my fiancée, and avoiding that relentless corporate grind I'd seen ruin so many lives around me. But when I told my boss, his face flashed from surprise to something I couldn't quite place, maybe disappointment or maybe something darker. Either way, he said he respected my choice and that the opportunity might still be there later, though he didn't sound convinced. The strange part was, I walked out of that meeting with a weird, unsettled feeling, like I'd made a decision that was going to echo far beyond just that room. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing changes, subtle at first. Meetings I used to be invited to suddenly didn't have my name on the list. Projects I'd spearheaded got shifted to other people without explanation. My boss became distant, almost cold. It wasn't anything overt, nothing you could put a finger on, but there was this sense of being slowly phased out. People I thought were allies, even friends in the office, began treating me differently, as if I was no longer part of the core team. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but then the passive-aggressive comments started, little digs about how some people aren't committed enough or might not be up for the challenge. It didn't take long to realize these were directed at me. One day, I ran into Mia after work, and when she asked how things were going, I made the mistake of telling her how much I regretted not taking the promotion. She gave me that sympathetic look but added something I didn't expect, that she was honestly relieved I hadn't accepted it. She said she missed me, missed us, and that this way, we'd have more time together, time to plan our future. I wanted to feel reassured by her words, but instead, I just felt like I was trapped between two walls that were slowly closing in, with the pressure from work on one side and Mia's expectations on the other. Then came the company-wide announcement of the new promotion candidate, Mark. I couldn't stand him, but he was technically competent, the kind of guy who did just enough to avoid trouble and somehow always ended up looking good to management. He'd only been with the company for 2 years, compared to my 5. But somehow he'd slid right into the position. The worst part was, he wasn't shy about rubbing it in, always dropping hints about his bright future and the vision he had for our team. I wanted to punch him, but I didn't. I just kept my head down, hoping to get through the awkwardness and move on. But with each passing day, the resentment ate at me, festering like a wound that wouldn't heal. And I began questioning everything, from my decision to Mia's support to whether I even wanted to be at this company anymore. One evening, after Mark had once again undermined me in front of the team, I got home, looked at myself in the mirror, and realized something: I was losing myself. The person staring back at me looked defeated, not like the ambitious, determined guy I used to be. And it was terrifying because I couldn't tell if that was from my own choice or if the environment around me was doing this to me. Things hit a breaking point at the next quarterly review. My performance scores, which had always been top tier, were suddenly below average. My boss, who usually praised my work, barely looked me in the eye as he went through my review, pointing out every minor flaw and emphasizing that I'd lost my edge. By then, it was clear. My career here was effectively over unless I did something drastic. I tried reaching out to HR, explaining the situation, the subtle retaliation, the snide comments, but they told me there was little they could do without hard evidence. Maybe you should consider a fresh start, they suggested, which was HR code for "we don't care." I remember leaving that meeting feeling like I was in free fall. Mia was supportive, but even she couldn't understand the full extent of it, the frustration, the shame. It felt like my life was unraveling. My job, my stability, my sense of self, it was all slipping through my fingers because of one decision. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I found out Mia had been planning a wedding date behind my back, even choosing a venue. She'd decided that since I was no longer on the promotion track, I'd have more time for us. She meant well, but it felt like a slap in the face. She didn't understand that my career wasn't just a job, it was a part of who I was, a part she was casually asking me to abandon for her vision of our future. That night, we had a massive fight. I told her everything, from the retaliation at work to how I felt like a stranger in my own life. She cried, saying she didn't know things were that bad, but the damage was done. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd let her, my job, and myself down. I'd let everyone control my life, and now I was stuck in a purgatory of my own making. Desperate to regain some control, I went to my boss and told him I was ready to step up, that I wanted another chance at the promotion. He looked at me with this smug smile, like he'd known I'd come crawling back. He told me they'd already moved on, that the company was looking for people fully committed to their role. In that moment, I realized he'd never intended to give me a second chance. I was just another pawn to him, a stepping stone for Mark, a warning to others about what happens when you don't fall in line. Feeling humiliated, I walked out of his office, and for the first time in my career, I didn't feel any loyalty to the company I'd sacrificed so much for. I realized I'd been clinging to an illusion, to a sense of loyalty that was never reciprocated. A week later, I handed in my resignation. The company barely reacted, and that hurt almost as much as everything else. I left without a plan, without even knowing what I wanted, just with the overwhelming need to escape. At first, I thought leaving would make me feel liberated, but instead, it felt like free falling. Job offers weren't rolling in like I'd expected. Mia and I drifted further apart, and the guilt of everything weighed on me. It was only after months of soul-searching that I found a small startup willing to take a chance on me. It wasn't glamorous, the pay was modest, and the hours were long, but for the first time in years, I felt a spark again. I had the freedom to make decisions, to learn from my mistakes, and rebuild myself on my own terms. Looking back, turning down that promotion had been the beginning of a painful journey that shattered my illusions but ultimately gave me the clarity I needed. I lost a lot, friends, stability, even my relationship with Mia, but I gained something far more valuable, the strength to start over and the wisdom to never let myself be boxed in again. If I could give advice to anyone reading this, it'd be this: sometimes, what feels like a wrong decision is just life pushing you toward the right path, no matter how painful the journey may be. I always prided myself on being a perfectionist, believed it was a necessary trait to succeed in this cutthroat world. My friends called me meticulous, my bosses noted my attention to detail, but there was always a darker side lurking beneath that polished exterior. It wasn't just that I hated making mistakes, I feared them. At some point, I became ensnared in a web of unattainable standards that left me drained and anxious. I remember one particularly stressful month. I had a report due at work, and the deadline was looming closer with each passing day. Instead of making progress, I spent hours arranging and rearranging my data, formatting my charts, and perfecting my vocabulary. On the night before the presentation, I barely slept, replaying every detail in my mind. I woke up to my friend screaming my name on the phone. It was a car accident, she needed me to come fast. Throwing on clothes and racing to the hospital, I could barely focus. I arrived at the emergency room, but my mind was still cluttered with thoughts of my presentation. Just as I stepped into the waiting area, a nurse came out solemnly, tears brimming in her eyes, telling us that my friend didn't make it. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I stood there, frozen, consumed by guilt. I had spent so much time obsessing over trivial things, and now I would never get to tell her how much she meant to me. In the days that followed, everything felt muted. The contrast of my grief and my perfectionism was staggering. I remember sitting on my bed, listless, staring at an empty notebook. The irony was not lost on me. Here I was, a perfectionist who failed to prioritize what truly mattered. I heard about a local support group through a friend. Reluctantly, I decided to go, thinking that perhaps other people carried the same burdens. The first session was filled with strangers sharing their stories of loss and despair. I remember a woman, trembling, detailing how she lost her brother to an overdose. It wasn't about grief alone, it was about letting go. I leaned in, captivated. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. That night, I realized how parallel my struggles were to their pain. I left that meeting feeling slightly lighter, and as the weeks passed, I kept returning. Gradually, I began to share my own story. I confessed how I wasn't just a perfectionist, I had used it as a shield from confronting my emotions, hiding behind it to keep relationships at arm's length. One night, just after I had shared, a woman approached me. She had this aura of both wisdom and kindness. She introduced herself as Sally and handed me a small, worn-out notebook. "This helped me when I was stuck in my head," she said. I was hesitant, after all, who had time for journaling when every letter had to be arranged perfectly. But something drew me in. That night, I started writing. At first, my entries were monotonous and robotic, but as the days passed, they turned into echoes of my thoughts, emotions swirling like autumn leaves in the wind. As I explored my feelings through writing, I began to see the ugly side of perfectionism as a mask I'd worn for too long. The pages filled with my insecurities, the moments I let slip by, and that feeling of never being enough started to pour out of me like water from a cracked dam. I started to reflect on all the times I had stood paralyzed, afraid to act, fearing I'd create something imperfect. Over time, my entries morphed into dialogue with myself. I began challenging the notion that perfection equated to success. Slowly, I started to embrace my flaws. During one of our meetings, I scribbled down a quote: "Perfection is the enemy of progress." I shared it with the group. There was a ripple of agreement, as more members offered their insights about how striving for perfection often kept us from evolving into who we were meant to be. Eventually, I began to let the grip of my perfectionist tendencies loosen. I recall walking into my office one day, a little bit lighter. Instead of obsessively checking every detail of my report, I submitted it with a sense of calm acceptance. I invited the inevitable feedback, welcoming any constructive criticism instead of bracing for a blow. And as bizarre as it was, I felt triumphant, not because the report was perfect, but because I was learning to free myself from that belief. Life hummed along over the next couple of months, each day a little easier than the last. I began to embrace spontaneity, diving headfirst into activities I would have once disregarded: painting, singing loudly in the car, dancing in the living room. One evening, I decided to take a watercolor class. I packed my supplies, determined to go in with an open heart. The canvas was blank and unassuming, but instead of trying to plan each brush stroke to perfection, I allowed myself to just create. Colors danced on the page, morphing into an abstract representation of my journey, the chaos, the joy, the beauty and imperfection. It was liberating, watching each color spread and bleed into one another. Sally's worn notebook became my sacred companion, filled with lessons learned, moments cherished, and even sketches of those beautiful, flawless disasters. I found solace in creating, in owning my narrative, realizing that no one compelled me to adhere to someone else's timeline. And then, came the day at the support group when the topic shifted back to grief. I shared my story about loss, my battle with perfectionism, and how I was reshaping my life. The group nodded, and I noticed the faces of those who once seemed distant. After the meeting, a few came up to me, tears in their eyes, telling me how my words resonated. Suddenly, my pain had a purpose, and I realized that my journey was not just about me anymore, it was about letting others know they were not alone. Reflections came flooding in after that night. I no longer wanted to be bound by the fear of imperfection. I wanted to open a dialogue about anxiety, grief, and the illusions we create in our heads. Instead of chasing perfection, I embraced progress, a messy, chaotic, authentic journey that allowed me to celebrate my imperfections. I learned to laugh at my mistakes, viewing them as stepping stones rather than obstacles, and slowly but surely, I began to heal. As the months rolled on, I kept attending the group and journaling. One night, I decided to write a letter to my friend I had lost. I let the words tumble out, no self-editing, just raw feelings of love, regret, and the lessons I had learned since she left. It felt cathartic, and as I sealed the envelope, I felt, for the first time in a long time, a wave of peace wash over me. I wanted to believe that I was learning to let go, but the reality was more complex. The ghosts of perfectionism still lingered from time to time. They would whisper in my ear whenever I was faced with a challenge. But I had built tools to confront those thoughts. I understood I could never erase those tendencies entirely, but instead chose to acknowledge and redirect them into something beautiful. Each brush stroke on my canvas became a reminder that I was not defined by my mistakes but shaped by them. So, to anyone else struggling with their own demons of high expectations, I hope you stumble into the passion of progress. Let go of that tight grip you have over every detail. Embrace the messy journey, and you might just find it leads you to the freedom you never knew you needed. I learned that through loss and grief, reality doesn't care for perfection. Life is raw, messy, chaotic, and beautifully imperfect. And genuinely, I'm learning to love every bit of it. The time I made a mistake and learned from it starts with me reflecting on a regret, one I've carried for years, but I've never shared it because it sounds insane, like something out of a horror film. But I feel compelled to get it off my chest now, especially since Halloween is around the corner, and I know I can't keep it bottled up any longer. It all started about 5 years ago when I was an anxious sophomore in college, dealing with the usual pressures of exams, relationships, and a desperate need to fit in. I wasn't exactly popular, but there was this one social event that seemed promising, a mysterious gathering in the woods that people whispered about. Imagine a bonfire in a secluded part of the forest, candles in paper bags outlining pathways, and flickering lights reflected off the leaves. It was supposed to be a night of revelations and connections, but deep down, I was terrified of what might actually happen, should I take that leap and step into the unknown. Nonetheless, curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself following a group of friends to the woods that fateful Friday night. The air was electric, charged with the thrill of untold secrets and laughter echoing around us. As we arrived, I was hit by the smell of smoke and the warmth of the crackling fire. People were engaged in deep conversations, and an unspoken bond pulsed through the night. I was told by my friend Sarah to look out for something called the offering. Apparently, it was some bizarre tradition where attendees would write their biggest fears on pieces of paper and toss them into a fire to, supposedly, cleanse themselves. Entering into the circle, I hesitated, mind racing with my own fears. I had issues, battles with anxiety, overwhelming pressure to succeed, and failing friendships. But I pushed the voice of doubt out of my head and found a scrap of paper in my pocket, scribbling my deepest fear with shaky hands. I tossed the paper into the fire as instructed, watching it curl and ignite, feeling an odd sense of relief wash over me, as if maybe releasing it would set me free. It felt comforting yet oddly unsettling. The night continued, spirits were high, and I met some cool people. A guy named Jake had a whole aura around him, charismatic and a bit mysterious, easily the kind of person who'd be the protagonist in one of those teen dramas. We chatted, laughed, and felt this undeniable chemistry. We even danced, albeit awkwardly, under the moonlight, and everything felt perfect for a moment. Things took a turn, though, when I stumbled upon a makeshift altar at the edge of the bonfire area. Candles flickered ominously amidst strange symbols sprawled across a piece of worn-down wood. In admission, my curiosity got the better of me again, and I approached it, noticing a tiny box nestled between two candles. Unmarked and old, it almost felt like it was calling out to me. In my impulsive nature, I reached for it, ignoring the whispered warnings of my friends. Laughter faded into the background as I opened the box and found a small mirror inside. The moment I looked at my reflection, everything around me shifted, the fire flickered out, shadows danced, and suddenly I wasn't just seeing my own reflection. I swear something stared back at me, an echo of darker me, someone with a twisted smirk, eyes glimmering with malice. Shock and fear took hold of me as I stumbled back, and in my panic, I knocked over one of the candles. It fell, and the flames licked dangerously close to the makeshift altar. People screamed and rushed to grab buckets of water to douse the flames while I held up the mirror, paralyzed by both fear and confusion. From that point on, everything spiraled. I could feel heat rising, and foreboding thoughts chased me like ghosts. It was as if something I had unleashed stirred beneath the surface. I hesitated too long, and when I finally let go of the mirror and tossed it aside, dark tendrils emerged from the shadows surrounding me. It's hard to describe, they twisted in unnatural ways, snatching poor Sarah, who had come to check on me. I could hear her scream, and it echoed in my head long after. The flames roared back to life as chaos ensued, and everyone rushed to escape the remnants of something unholy we had awakened. I stumbled back toward the bonfire, caught between horror and regret. The night ended with our group scattered, and I finally recalled one of those elder warnings about the woods, rumors of spirits, of those who had come too close and stayed too long. They became part of the forest, forever lost. I knew I had made a grave mistake. In the aftermath, I couldn't shake the feeling of accountability. My reckless curiosity led to something darker. The guilt consumed me, like a parasite burrowing deeper with each passing day. I never spoke to my friends again, convinced they'd blame me for what happened. The whispers and stares from classmates made it worse. I became a ghost in the halls of my own college, burdened with fear and a heavy conscience. To this day, I struggle to forgive myself. Months felt like years, and then one night, I decided to face my fears. I returned to the forest, the place where it all began, alone. It was eerie, that same unmistakable energy thrumming through the air. But at the heart of it, maybe I hoped to find some semblance of closure. I brought a new paper and a pen, and I found my way back to that spot. The bonfire was long gone, but the circle was faintly etched into the ground, as if the past was still lingering there. I shot my fears out into the darkness once more, knowing full well that this time, they wouldn't consume me. I learned that mistake makes us human, but the aftermath can either strengthen us or break us. And as I stood there, I felt a flicker of hope. As crazy as it sounds, I think I even heard a faint whisper of forgiveness trailing off with the wind. So if you find yourself at a gathering that tempts the unknown, remember this: curiosity can unlock doors better left shut. You can learn from your mistakes, but some shadows might haunt you forever. Whatever choices you make, carry your fears with openness, for they are but a reflection. You'll find strength if you dare face what lies beneath. Please, don't make the mistakes I did. Let my tale serve as a warning, a reminder to tread carefully in realms where darkness lurks and curiosity can ignite something you may never recover from. The time I gave advice and it backfired spectacularly. It was supposed to be a simple thing, giving a piece of advice to a friend, something I thought would help them. At the time, I had no idea how badly it would backfire. It all started one Friday afternoon when I met up with my friend Mark at our usual spot, a coffee shop near our office. Mark had been struggling with his relationship for a while. He'd been dating Lisa for nearly a year, and things weren't going great. There was constant tension between them, and he couldn't seem to figure out why. It wasn't that they didn't love each other, it was more like they were two people who had drifted apart but couldn't let go. He had been asking for my advice for weeks, but I'd never been able to offer anything concrete. That day, however, something changed. He sat across from me, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup, looking like a man on the edge. "I don't know what to do, man. I feel like every time I try to talk to Lisa, she shuts me down. I don't even know if I can keep doing this," he said, his voice a mixture of frustration and despair. I could see the desperation in his eyes, and for some reason, I felt compelled to offer him some words of wisdom. I wasn't an expert on relationships, but I'd had my fair share of ups and downs. "Look, man," I said, leaning in, "sometimes in relationships, you have to put yourself first. If you're feeling unhappy, if you're feeling like things aren't working, you need to communicate that. But you also need to take a step back and think about what you truly want. You've got to be honest with yourself and with her." I could see Mark nodding, taking in my words, and for a moment, I thought he was really starting to get it. He looked like he was relieved, like he had finally heard something that made sense to him. That's actually not a bad idea," he said, his face brightening up. "I think I'm going to do it. I'm going to tell her how I feel, and maybe we can work through it." I felt a surge of confidence in that moment. I thought I had helped him. I thought that maybe my advice would be the thing that turned things around for him. The next week, however, things took a drastic turn. I didn't hear from Mark for a few days, and when I finally did, it wasn't at all what I had expected. I got a text message from him that read, "Hey, we need to talk. It's about Lisa." My heart sank. I had no idea what had happened, but I feared the worst. I immediately called him, and after a few rings, he picked up. His voice sounded flat, almost defeated. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, though I could feel the anxiety creeping up. "Dude, it's bad. I took your advice. I sat Lisa down, told her exactly how I felt, told her I needed space, that things weren't working, and she just exploded," Mark said, his voice cracking. I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, trying to process what he was saying. "What do you mean, exploded?" I asked cautiously. "She just lost it. Started yelling at me, calling me selfish, saying I didn't care about her." I tried to stay calm, but the more I tried to explain, the worse it got. "She packed up her stuff and left. It's over, man. I don't know what to do." I could hear the pain in his voice, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I had no idea that my advice would have such a devastating impact. I had no idea that telling him to be honest about his feelings would lead to a breakup. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said, my mind racing. "Maybe you should try talking to her again, explain that you didn't mean to hurt her." "I did," Mark interrupted, frustration creeping into his voice. "I've been calling her nonstop, trying to fix it, but she won't pick up. It's like I don't even exist to her anymore." I was speechless. I didn't know what to say. I felt responsible for the mess that had been made. What was supposed to be a simple piece of advice had spiraled into something far worse. I spent the next few days trying to help Mark fix things, but the situation didn't improve. Lisa wasn't answering his calls or texts, and he was left spiraling deeper into a pit of regret. I tried to console him, but the guilt weighed heavily on me. I had given him advice, and it had destroyed his relationship. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It felt like everything I had said was wrong, like I had made things worse instead of better. I tried to remind myself that Mark was the one who had ultimately made the decision to confront Lisa, but it didn't feel like that mattered. He was my friend, and I had failed him. Then, one day, a few weeks after the breakup, I received a message from Mark that caught me completely off guard. "Hey, I need to talk to you," the text read. My stomach dropped. Was he going to blame me for everything again? Was he angry with me? I called him immediately, and this time, when he answered, his voice was lighter, almost relieved. "What's going on?" I asked, still bracing myself for the worst. "I know this sounds crazy, but I think I've figured it out," Mark said. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about putting myself first and being honest with what I need. I didn't realize it before, but maybe I've been holding on to something that wasn't meant to be. Lisa and I weren't right for each other, and maybe that's why we were always fighting. I think I needed to hear what you said to finally see it. My heart skipped a beat. So, what does that mean? It means I'm okay. I'm going to be fine. I've started focusing on myself, on what I want. I don't want to get back with Lisa, and I think that's the best thing for both of us, Mark said. I just wanted to say thanks, man. Your advice. It helped me see the truth. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For a moment, I was relieved, but then, the full scope of it hit me. The advice I had given had set off a chain of events that, at first, seemed catastrophic, but in the end, it had helped Mark come to terms with the reality of his relationship. It wasn't the way I had imagined it would go, but maybe, just maybe, it was what he needed to hear. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had almost ruined his life with a simple piece of advice. It had backfired spectacularly, just not in the way I had expected. I learned a valuable lesson that day. Sometimes, the right advice isn't about offering solutions, it's about giving someone the space to find their own. In the end, I guess I had played a part in his growth. But it will forever be a reminder that giving advice is a double-edged sword. I had always been a skeptic. The kind of person who dismissed anything that seemed too surreal or impossible. When my friends told me about a class they were taking, a philosophy of existence course at a local community college, I laughed it off. I had no interest in pondering the meaning of life or whatever fluffy content they were feeding into those lecture halls. But one fateful Tuesday, as the autumn leaves danced spirals around my feet, something strange nudged me towards the campus. Call it curiosity or boredom, maybe both, but after a brief tug-of-war with my conscience, I found myself signing up for the course. I shouldn't have, but something in the air felt charged, almost electric. The room was dimly lit and packed, crammed with faces of varying ages, students, old folks, even a woman with silver hair knitting quietly in the back. The professor was an eccentric old man with wild spectacles that seemed to magnify his blue eyes. He introduced himself as Dr. Langston, and I could tell he was passionate. He spoke about existence as if it were a tangible object, oscillating in space like the planets in our solar system. On that first day, he showed us a video, a documentary with unsettling footage of people living in dire conditions, juxtaposed against the backdrop of everyday life in affluent neighborhoods. It was jarring. Over the weeks that followed, Dr. Langston pushed us beyond our comfort zones. He encouraged us to think deeply, debate fiercely, and unearth our assumptions about life. One day, he handed us an assignment that sent chills up my spine: write about a moment when your life was altered irrevocably. I struggled initially, racking my brain for something significant, something profound. I ended up recounting a mundane experience, a harmless car accident I had as a teenager. I felt silly. But when I read my paper aloud, something strange happened. I became lost in the emotions of that event, the crippling fear, the chaos of twisting metal, and the bone-deep realization that life is fragile. Dr. Langston listened intently, nodding with understanding. But that week, a gravitational shift began in my perspective. I started to observe the world differently. The old man's words lingered like a fog, drawing my attention to the mundane miracles around me, the way light glimmered through leaves or how strangers smiled unexpectedly. I felt detached, like a ghost wandering my own life. But it wasn't all zen. Soon, I began to see something unshakable lurking beneath the surface. One day, Dr. Langston announced a special guest for our class, a former student named Alice, who had taken the course nearly a decade prior. Her stories were mesmerizing, filled with emotions and hard-won wisdom about grief and loss. But there was a haunting quality in her eyes, an urgency that pushed her words. As she spoke about her journey losing a loved one, something peculiar occurred: people began to cry. It was cathartic. For many, I sensed it was a release of burdens too heavy to carry alone. But in that vulnerable moment, I felt an unseen veil tear. I was drawn to the idea that maybe, just maybe, life wasn't just about existence, it was about connection, about choice, about love and loss intertwined. I began spending hours contemplating my own connections, allowing old memories to swell, but not just those of joy. The more I dove into my past, the darker it became. The shadow of guilt for how I had treated people flickered back into view. After weeks of introspection, I learned about each classmate's journey. Each person sat with their own ghosts, and there were whispered tales of heartache, betrayal, and redemption. My cynicism began to erode, replaced by a jagged clarity about what truly mattered. One evening, Dr. Langston announced an upcoming field trip, a visit to an abandoned asylum, a relic of forgotten lives once lived. The class was invited to explore the ruins and think about the people who had been lost to time. I'll never forget that night. Walking through the darkened halls of that asylum, I felt the weight of each soul that once inhabited that space, their stories hushed by shadow. As we wandered, I couldn't help but imagine their lives, their laughter, their sorrows echoing off the crumbling walls. I found myself alone in a musty room filled with peeling wallpaper. That's when I saw it, a figure, translucent and draped in a gown, standing in the corner. She stared right at me, her features obscured by time. My breath caught in my throat. Instinctively, I reached out to touch her, but she flickered and disappeared like smoke. What the hell was happening? Was I losing my mind? I stumbled into the hallway, shaken, and joined my classmates who were gathered around Dr. Langston, discussing what they had felt. I could only stand silent in shock, burdened with visions of the past. Over the following weeks, I frequently found myself returning to the asylum, sneaking away to relive the exploration, delving into those corridors filled with echoes of life long gone. Each trip intensified the sensation that I was meant to uncover something vital there, something connecting my own life to theirs. As the semester drew to a close, I was approached by Dr. Langston after class. He sat me down, his manner serious but compassionate. He told me he could see how deeply I was affected, how the threads of my existence were intertwining with the spectral energy of the asylum. He urged me to confront these feelings, to no longer suppress the past that had haunted me. You need to embrace it, he said, the chaos, it's an essential part of your journey. The end of that semester felt like the climax of a grand narrative. The experiences had reshaped my understanding of everything. I left the classroom that day with a weight in my chest yet a clarity in my mind. I finally understood, life was made up of moments, connections, and the irreplaceable fragments of our existence. I realized that my skeptically barricaded heart had cracked open, allowing the light of connection and vulnerability within. Even as the leaves fell behind me, I felt renewed. Then, without warning, tragedy struck just days later. I received a text. Dr. Langston had passed away unexpectedly, an aneurysm. The news pulled the rug out from under me. It felt surreal, as if the fabric of my new reality were unraveling. I rushed to campus, desperate to find some semblance of understanding among my classmates who shared this profound loss. We gathered, exchanged memories, grief spilling forth and gathering like storm clouds. That night, we returned to the asylum, candles in hand, and shared our stories, the air thick with emotion. In that hollow space of forgotten lives, we created our own. Tears mingled with laughter as we spoke of the old man who had changed us all. His words had lingered, woven through each corner of our experiences, binding us together even in our sorrow. I realized, in that moment, how deeply connected we all are, how each whisper of past lives weaves the tapestry of our own. It was a class that did change my perspective on life, but more than that, it was the depth of connection I experienced that night, a profound reminder that the weight of existence is best carried together. Sometimes, change comes when you least expect it, enmeshed in the most mundane moments that flicker like shadows, urging you to embrace every fleeting chance at connection. To this day, I carry Dr. Langston's lessons with me, a guiding star shining through the noise of existence, and I write this with the hope that others may realize we are never alone in the chaos. Yes, life is fragile and fleeting, but it's also filled with moments, connections, and echoes of those who have walked before us, each one a lesson waiting to be unwrapped. An unexpected reunion with my first love, the drama. An unexpected reunion with my first love, the drama. It started as a regular weekend, or at least I thought it would be, with plans to attend a friend's engagement party at a cozy little venue on the outskirts of town. I was excited, dressed in my best, and ready to celebrate. Little did I know, I was about to come face to face with someone I'd once thought I'd spend my entire life with, my first love. I hadn't seen him in years, and honestly, I thought I'd buried that chapter of my life deep enough that it would never resurface. But there he was, standing across the room, looking as if time had barely touched him. He was talking to someone, laughing in that way I'd remembered all too well, the way that used to make my heart race. For a second, I felt like a teenager again, overcome with a wave of nostalgia, mixed with that pit in your stomach kind of feeling that I hadn't experienced in ages. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but somehow, I couldn't. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he looked right at me. Our eyes met, and in that split second, the years seemed to melt away, replaced by the raw memory of everything we'd been, and all we hadn't been. He made his way over, and with each step, my heart raced faster. I could barely manage to steady myself as he smiled and said, "Hey, it's been a while, hasn't it?" My mind raced through everything I wanted to say, the questions I'd had for years, the things left unsaid. But all that came out was, "Yeah, it really has." We fell into easy conversation, which surprised me. Somehow, it felt like no time had passed at all. We reminisced about our shared memories, the ridiculous things we'd done as young, foolish kids in love, and there was a part of me that wondered if maybe, just maybe, we could start over. That's when the door opened, and she walked in. She was beautiful, elegant, and confident, the kind of woman who radiated poise and style, the type I'd always felt I could never be. She walked right over to us and slid her arm around his waist, giving me a quick, appraising look before flashing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said, extending a hand. He looked a little uneasy, as if he hadn't expected her to show up just yet, but he quickly masked it with a smile of his own. "This is my fiancé," he said, his words stabbing through me like a knife. Fiancé. The word hung heavy in the air, filling the space between us with a thick, awkward tension. I forced a smile, trying to hide the hurt that was clawing its way to the surface. He had moved on, and clearly, he was serious about this woman, this stranger who now stood beside him, claiming the future we'd once dreamed of sharing. It was a strange feeling, to see the life I'd imagined with him in someone else's hands. I could tell Sarah was trying to gauge me, her eyes flicking back and forth between us, perhaps sensing the history that was silently screaming between us. She didn't let go of him, holding on to him a little tighter, as if staking her claim. I excused myself, pretending I needed to grab a drink, hoping to escape before my emotions betrayed me. As I stood at the bar, clutching my drink, trying to steady my breathing, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was him again, and the look in his eyes told me he'd followed me to talk. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight," he said softly, as if that would somehow soften the blow of seeing him with someone else. "Neither did I replied, not meeting his gaze. "But I guess life has a funny way of throwing curveballs," he sighed, and for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something more, something deeper, but instead, he just apologized. He apologized for everything, how things ended, how he handled it, how he moved on too fast. He admitted that he'd thought about reaching out 1,000 times but never did, fearing it would stir up old wounds. The sincerity in his voice made it worse because part of me wanted to forgive him, to let it go, but the other part of me was still hurt, still carrying the weight of what we'd lost. Before I could respond, Sarah appeared beside us, her gaze sharp, clearly not pleased with how close we were standing. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, her voice polite but laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. I nodded quickly, eager to escape the tension. I could see that she was uncomfortable, and honestly, so was I. I didn't want to be the reason for any strain between them, didn't want to be a shadow from the past creeping into his new life. I excused myself again, but this time, he didn't follow. As the evening went on, I found myself constantly aware of them, stealing glances when I thought no one was watching. And each time I saw them together, laughing, whispering, holding hands, a part of me ached with the realization that he had moved on, and I hadn't. I'd been holding on to a ghost, a memory, while he'd built a future with someone else. Toward the end of the night, just as I was about to leave, he came up to me one last time. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said, his tone soft, almost regretful. I managed a small smile, knowing this was truly the end. "Goodbye," I replied, feeling a strange mix of closure and lingering sadness. As I walked away, I couldn't help but wonder what could have been, but I also realized that maybe this was the universe's way of finally setting me free. I left the party with a heavy heart, but also with a sense of clarity. It hurt, yes, but I knew it was time to let go, to move on, and to find happiness in the life I had, rather than the life I'd once dreamed of with him. The past would always be a part of me, but it no longer had to define me. My friend's partner made a pass at me, should I tell them? It all started on a seemingly normal Saturday evening, when my friend Mia invited me over for a small get-together. Mia and I had been best friends since childhood, navigating the ups and downs of life together. She had recently started dating a guy named Tom, who seemed charming and funny at first. I hadn't known him for long, but he quickly integrated himself into our friend group, and I wanted to be supportive. As the night unfolded, laughter filled the room. Mia and Tom were cozy on the couch, and the rest of us were enjoying snacks and drinks. Everything felt light and fun, but something shifted when the two of them stepped outside for a moment, leaving me alone in the living room with Tom's friend, Mark. Mark had always been friendly, but there was a tension in the air that night. After a couple of drinks, he leaned in closer to me, his breath warm against my ear as he whispered, "You know, I've always thought you were really attractive." My heart raced, unsure how to respond. I chuckled awkwardly, brushing it off as a drunken compliment. But as the night went on, Mark's comments became bolder. "You'd be a lot more fun to hang out with than Mia," he said, flashing a grin that made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, but I felt a knot forming in my stomach. When Mia returned, I desperately wanted to confide in her, but I hesitated. What if she didn't believe me? What if it ruined their relationship? As the evening progressed, I kept a close eye on Mark, who continued to make subtle advances. He'd touch my arm lightly when he spoke, and at one point, he even leaned in to kiss my cheek, his lips lingering a bit too long. I felt frozen in that moment, torn between loyalty to my friend and the unsettling realization that I was being pursued by her partner's friend. I spent the rest of the evening trying to act normal, but I could feel the weight of Mark's gaze on me. Every time I caught his eye, my heart would race, and I could feel my palms sweat. I wanted to leave but didn't want to hurt Mia's feelings or cause a scene. As the night drew to a close, I finally mustered the courage to confront Mark. "You should really stop flirting with me," I said firmly, my voice shaking slightly. He laughed it off, acting as if I was overreacting, which only made me more uneasy. After everyone had left, I stayed behind to help Mia clean up. As we sorted through empty bottles and plates, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. Should I tell her what had happened? I imagined how she might react. Would she think I was lying or just trying to stir up drama? Mia and I had always promised to be honest with each other, but this felt different. I had never wanted to come between her and someone she cared about, especially not for something like this. That night, I hardly slept. I tossed and turned, replaying every moment in my head, questioning if I should reach out to Mia or keep my mouth shut. The next few days dragged on as I grappled with the situation. I started distancing myself from Mark, avoiding gatherings where he might be present. But each time I saw Mia, I felt the guilt creep back in. Finally, after a week of internal turmoil, I decided to confide in my best friend. We met at our favorite cafe, and I felt a mix of dread and relief as I sat across from her. I hesitated, unsure of how to start. "Mia, can we talk about something?" I said, my voice trembling slightly. She looked at me curiously, sensing my unease. "Of course, what's wrong?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my words. "It's about Tom's friend, Mark." Mia's expression shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing. "What about him?" I recounted everything that had happened that night, the compliments, the lingering touches, the way I felt uncomfortable. As I spoke, I watched her face transform from confusion to disbelief. "Are you serious? He did that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. I nodded, tears welling in my eyes. "I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to cause problems, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." Mia's hands trembled as she processed what I was saying. "I can't believe this," she said, shaking her head. "I thought he was different." I felt a mix of relief and fear wash over me. Relief that I had finally told her, but fear of how she would react. Would she confront Mark? Would it damage their relationship? What should I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mia looked determined. "You deserve to feel safe around my boyfriend's friends, and I'm going to talk to him about this." My heart sank a little, knowing that it could create tension between them. "Are you sure?" I asked hesitantly. "I don't want to cause drama." "This isn't drama," she replied fiercely. "This is about respect. I can't let someone treat my friends like that." I felt a rush of gratitude for her support, but deep down, I feared how Tom might react. Mia promised to have a conversation with him that evening. I left the cafe feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. That night, I received a text from Mia. "I talked to Tom. He's going to confront Mark. I'll let you know what happens." I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but a gnawing anxiety settled in its place. Would Mark deny it? Would he retaliate against me for saying something? I spent the night anxiously awaiting her update, wondering how it would all play out. The next day, Mia called me, her voice shaky. "Hey, can we meet up again? I need to talk to you." My heart raced as I agreed, fearing the worst. When I arrived, I could see she had been crying. "What happened?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Tom confronted Mark, and it didn't go well," she admitted, wiping her eyes. "Mark denied everything and accused me of being jealous. He said I was just trying to break them up." I felt a surge of anger for her, knowing how unfair it was. "That's ridiculous. You're not jealous, you're protecting yourself and your friends." Mia nodded, clearly hurt. "But Tom is caught in the middle. He doesn't know what to believe." As we talked, I felt an overwhelming urge to take responsibility for what had happened. "Maybe I should reach out to Tom," I suggested. "I can tell him what Mark said and how uncomfortable I felt." "Are you sure?" Mia asked, concern etched on her face. "I don't want you to feel pressured." I took a deep breath, determined to take action. "I need to be honest with him, for both of our sakes." That evening, I texted Tom, asking if we could talk. He replied almost immediately, agreeing to meet. As I walked into the coffee shop, my heart raced. When I saw Tom, he looked tense. "Hey," he said, offering a weak smile. "I've been hearing some things." I nodded, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just wanted to clear the air about Mark. He made me uncomfortable at the party, and I feel like it's important you know what happened." As I recounted my experience, Tom's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "I can't believe he did that," he said, shaking his head. "I'm sorry you had to go through this." I felt a mix of relief and anxiety as we talked. Tom listened, validating my feelings and expressing anger towards Mark's behavior. "I'll talk to him again," he said, determination in his voice. I left feeling hopeful that we were on the same page, but I still feared the fallout. In the following days, the tension in our friend group was palpable. Mark tried to brush off what happened, acting as if it were a joke, but it was clear that trust had been broken. Mia and Tom had to reevaluate their relationship with him, and it strained their dynamic. As the weeks went by, I learned how difficult it can be to navigate friendships and relationships when lines get blurred. Eventually, Tom decided to cut ties with Mark, realizing that his behavior was unacceptable. Mia supported him wholeheartedly, and I felt a mix of relief and guilt for how everything unfolded. I knew that I had done the right thing by speaking up, but it came at a cost. I still worried about how Mark would react if he found out I had spoken to Tom. But as time went on, Mia and Tom grew stronger, their bond solidified by the challenges they faced together. And I felt grateful to have friends who valued honesty and respect above all else. So, my advice to anyone in a similar situation: speak up. It's never easy, but your feelings matter, and standing up for yourself can lead to a healthier, more honest environment. Sometimes, you have to take risks to protect the ones you love, and in the end, it's worth it. Entitled Aunt tries to take over my birthday, chaos ensues. It was supposed to be a day of joy, a day that was all about me, my birthday. Ever since I was a kid, I had a special tradition. I would spend the day with my closest friends, indulging in cake, laughter, and all the things that made me feel loved. This year was no different. I had planned everything meticulously. The decorations were colorful, the cake was a masterpiece, and the guest list was filled with the people who mattered most to me. But then, there was Aunt Linda. My mom's sister. She had always been a bit overbearing, but this time she took it to a whole new level. Just 2 days before my birthday, I received a call from my mom. "Linda wants to come over for your birthday," she said. "Is that okay?" I felt my stomach drop. "I thought we agreed it would just be a small gathering," I replied. "Well, she insists on bringing her famous punch," my mom said, almost apologetically. "You know how she is." Of course, I did. Aunt Linda had a knack for inserting herself into every family event, but this was my birthday, and I wanted it to be just my friends and me. "Can we just keep it small?" I pleaded. "I really don't want a big family affair this year." My mom sighed. "I'll talk to her." But I knew my mom would never say no to her sister, and the moment I heard that Aunt Linda was coming, I braced myself for chaos. The day of my birthday arrived, and the decorations sparkled as my friends began to trickle in. The house was alive with laughter and chatter, and I felt a sense of happiness wash over me. But then, just as we were about to cut the cake, Aunt Linda burst through the door, carrying a massive, gaudy birthday banner that read "Happy Birthday to my favorite niece." I froze, a wave of dread washing over me. "Surprise," she exclaimed, completely ignoring my plans. My friends exchanged glances, and I could feel the atmosphere shift. "Aunt Linda, thank you, but we were just about to," I started, but she interrupted me with a laugh. "Oh, honey, don't worry. This is just a little something I whipped up. You know, make it more festive." She immediately began rearranging the decorations, moving my carefully placed balloons to make room for her ugly banner. My friends awkwardly shuffled around, unsure of what to do. I felt my excitement dwindling as Aunt Linda continued to take charge, handing out her infamous punch and encouraging everyone to drink up. "You all need to loosen up. It's a party," she shouted, and the once intimate gathering felt like a chaotic family reunion. As the punch flowed, Aunt Linda began to tell embarrassing stories about my childhood, the ones I had hoped would stay buried. "Remember the time she fell in the cake at her 5th birthday?" She laughed, and I wanted to sink into the floor. My friends exchanged knowing looks, their smiles fading as they realized that my birthday was being hijacked. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and frustration bubbling inside me. "Aunt Linda, can we please focus on my birthday?" I asked, my voice strained. "I'd like to celebrate with my friends." She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, sweetheart, they're part of the family now. Let's just enjoy the moment." The punch continued to flow, and before long, my friends were getting tipsy, caught up in Aunt Linda's wild stories and loud laughter. I watched as the vibe shifted from my birthday celebration to a chaotic family gathering. I had planned games and activities, but Aunt Linda had other ideas. "Why don't we all play a fun game I brought?" she announced, pulling out a gigantic inflatable unicorn. "Let's do a relay race." My heart sank further. A relay race? This wasn't what I wanted. My friends looked bewildered, caught off guard by the sudden change of pace. How about we just eat cake?" one of them suggested, but Aunt Linda was already in full swing, dragging everyone outside to set up the race. I felt trapped. I glanced at my mom, hoping for some support, but she just shrugged apologetically, caught in Aunt Linda's whirlwind of enthusiasm. The chaos outside was unbearable. People were yelling, laughing, and running around, and I felt completely invisible. My birthday, my special day, had turned into a chaotic circus, and I was the unwilling ringmaster. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Aunt Linda decided it was time for a surprise twist. "Let's have a dance-off," she shouted, and before I could protest, she turned on some loud music and began dancing like a fool. My friends hesitated, caught between wanting to join the fun and recognizing that this wasn't the celebration I had envisioned. I stood off to the side, watching the madness unfold, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. I just wanted to enjoy my day, to be with my friends without Aunt Linda's interference. As the dance-off grew more chaotic, with Aunt Linda showing off her questionable moves, I finally snapped. "Enough," I shouted, my voice cutting through the noise. Everyone turned to me, surprised. This is my birthday, and I want it to be a celebration with my friends, not a circus act. The music stopped, and an awkward silence fell over the crowd. Aunt Linda looked taken aback, her smile faltering. "But I was just trying to have fun," she said, her tone defensive. "You're ruining the party." My friends murmured in agreement, and I could see them shifting uncomfortably. "This isn't what I wanted, Aunt Linda. I appreciate your effort, but you've taken over my day, and it feels like it's not even mine anymore." The tension hung in the air, and I could see the hurt in her eyes. For a moment, I felt guilty, but I quickly reminded myself that I had every right to stand up for my birthday. "It's supposed to be about me and my friends, not a family gathering," I continued. "I wanted to celebrate with the people I chose, not to compete with a party that I never asked for." Aunt Linda crossed her arms, her expression shifting from hurt to frustration. "You're being selfish. I just wanted to make it special for you." I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "I get that, but this isn't how I wanted to celebrate. I need you to respect my wishes." After what felt like an eternity, Aunt Linda finally sighed, the fight draining from her. "Fine. I'll let you have your birthday." The crowd shifted, and I could feel the atmosphere changing. My friends began to cheer, encouraging Aunt Linda to join us for cake and games instead of the chaotic activities she had planned. Slowly, she smiled again, realizing that we could compromise. As we gathered around the cake, I felt a rush of relief. I blew out the candles, and my friends erupted into cheers, and for the first time that day, it felt like my birthday again. We cut the cake, shared stories, and enjoyed each other's company, and Aunt Linda even joined in the festivities, letting go of her overbearing ways. By the end of the night, I had realized that while Aunt Linda might be entitled and overbearing, she also loved me in her own way. The chaos had transformed into something surprisingly special, and I learned that sometimes, it takes a little conflict to bring people together. My birthday may not have gone as planned, but it became a day filled with laughter, love, and a newfound understanding between my aunt and me. So if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember to stand up for yourself, but also be open to the unexpected twists life throws your way. I have a story that feels too surreal to be real, but I assure you it is. What happened to me forever changed how I view failure, but it also left a mark on my soul that I cannot unsee. It started like any other night. I was seated at my desk, fidgeting with my pen as I prepared myself to submit my manuscript for a writing contest that had drawn considerable attention. This was it for me. As a struggling writer, I had always feared that my talent could be a mirage, a temporary reflection in a dark pool of self-doubt. The contest was my opportunity to confront that fear head-on, yet I hesitated. My mind twisted like a frayed wire at the mere thought of rejection. Stories of failure flooded my mind, dreams of accolades vanishing as quickly as they appeared, and the laughter of friends who had already published their own work ringing in my ears like a haunting echo. It grew late, and the silence of my apartment became an echo chamber for my anxiety. I reread my manuscript for what felt like the 100th time, searching for errors, flaws, anything that might hint that I wasn't worthy. Just as I was about to close my laptop for the night, an unfamiliar notification chirped on my phone. To my surprise, a message from a childhood friend, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, popped up. "Hey! Long time no see. You remember that time at camp, right? I think I still have that old journal we found." It triggered a wave of nostalgia. I remembered that summer, the smell of pine trees, the warmth of the sun, and two kids sharing secrets beneath the stars. As I dug deeper into those memories, I recalled how we'd written fantastical stories, daring each other to share them aloud around the campfire. But there was one story I had never shared, an original tale of a haunted typewriter that cursed its user to write nothing but their worst fears, inked in fear and ink. That night, moved by the reminder of my younger self and fueled by both nostalgia and absurdity, I decided to type my version of that story. I began typing furiously, words tumbling out more swiftly than I could think, shadows from the past illuminating the dark corners of my mind, where the fear of failure lurked like a predator. The tale unfolded into a tale about a girl named Elise who, unwittingly, inherited an old typewriter shunned by every writer in town. They said it was cursed. It morphed into a vessel for every insecurity and fear, urging its owner to scribble with the weight of dread. With every keystroke, the girl lost herself deeper within the typewriter as it manipulated her mind into crafting twisted tales filled with failure. I became absorbed in the narrative, feeling a strange connection to Elise and the dread of her impending doom as I hammered out the last stanzas. Somehow, that energy expelled some of my own fears, and as the story came to life, I felt liberated. When I finally finished, an odd sense of clarity washed over me, a realization that my darkest fears were merely shrouded in myth, like the typewriter itself. Taking a deep breath, I read my piece aloud, the very words that had echoed in Elise's mind now offering solace instead of suffocation. I felt an unexpected triumph as if I were unveiling a hidden truth about myself to the world. When I clicked submit, I could practically hear 1,000 mini explosions of doubt and anxiety fading into oblivion. I was free. That euphoric feeling lasted precisely 6 hours until I received an email notifying me that my entry had been shortlisted. Panic surged through me. Winning was now a breath away, and the shadow of fear crawled back, twisting like a snake around my heart. I didn't want to fail, I didn't want to be the girl who wrote but never published, who dreams without action. So, I found a way to put the fear to rest. I thought back to Elise and her cursed typewriter, maybe I could confront my fear like she did. I decided to hold an impromptu reading in a local cafe, where any regular could attend. I reached out to a handful of friends, and to my astonishment, they rallied, sharing the event on social media, enticing others to join. I scheduled the reading with just days to prepare. The moment the cafe filled with warm chatter, people laughing and sipping their lattes, my heart began racing. The typewriter's curse had came true, my fears echoed with every heartbeat. But as I stood behind the microphone, I could almost feel Elise's spirit beside me, urging me to speak, to reclaim the control I believed I had lost. So, I did. I opened my mouth and started, and as I read my story, I could see the audience leaning forward, captivated. Their gazes were nothing but warm encouragement, erasing the doubt that threatened to drown me whole. Unbeknownst to me, the cafe owner recorded the reading, and later chose to post snippets online. The clip went viral. The encouragement I received cut through the fog of despair that had reeled me back after the thrill of submitting my work. I had been met with kindness, applause, and the acknowledgement that failure was not the end, but merely a step on my journey. As I left that cafe, the sun was casting its golden light across the city, and I felt changed. I realized that confronting my fear of failure didn't mean avoiding it, it meant accepting it, allowing it to fuel my passion. Failure wasn't a monster lurking in the dark, it was a critical part of my story. So, the next day in a wave of courage, I shared the recording from that reading online. The response was overwhelming. Fellow writers from around the world sent messages of support and encouragement. I even received an invitation to be a guest speaker at a writer's workshop. The comments flooded in, words of gratitude filling my inbox. I became a beacon for others who bore the same burdens. Through embracing that fear, I not only uncovered resilience within myself, but a community that thrived on vulnerability and authenticity. Fast forward a few months, I was invited to a literary festival, sharing stages with authors I'd admired. But there was a small part of me that remained vigilant of the lurking fears that once threatened to bury me. During one of the panels, I spoke about my journey, how I had tapped into a long-buried passion through the shadows of fear and doubt. It was cathartic, and as the audience listened, I felt a connection, a shared experience that transcended my own insecurities. I left the stage, thinking about Elise, the haunted typewriter, and the message I wanted to share: it was okay to fail. Failure doesn't define you, it allows you to rise again. Embracing it is where the magic happens, where art is born, where connections are forged. So, if you're reading this and awake in the struggles of your mind, remember the twist: failure is part of the journey, not something to be feared but an inevitable step towards success. I confronted my fear of failure, and while it still clings like dust, I've learned to dance with it, to turn setbacks into stepping stones on the beautiful, chaotic path of being human. I will continue to write, to share my truth, and to encourage others to excavate their own stories, because the world needs your voice. I used to be a nature lover. I spent my childhood frolicking in fields, climbing trees, and basking in the beauty of the great outdoors. Those tranquil days faded as I grew up. The concrete jungle of city life squeezed the joy from my heart, and with it, my appreciation for the wild world around me. But everything changed last summer when a friend convinced me to join a hiking group. It felt like a desperate attempt to reconnect with a self I thought I had lost forever. I should have known better than to explore the woods alone. With the sun slowly dipping below the horizon, the shadows in the forest began to twist into grotesque shapes. The rustling of leaves sounded ominous, and I suddenly felt the thrill of being completely alone in an endless green labyrinth. But, despite the unsettling feeling gnawing at me, I trudged on, determined to find the solace I once knew. The air was thick with humidity, and every breath felt heavy as if the forest was leaning in closer, waiting for something. The trail narrowed, the trees surrounding me tightening their grasp. It was just past dusk when I stumbled into a clearing. A mist rolled in, softening the edges of the trees and creating an otherworldly atmosphere. At first, I thought it was beautiful, but something felt off. Then I heard it, a soft, haunting melody that seemed to rise from the ground. The sound was ethereal, like nature itself was singing, begging me to come closer. Mesmerized, I stepped forward, the cool ground squishing beneath my shoes. The source of the music was not visible, and I felt a twinge of anxiety, but I pushed it away. Just as I was about to turn back, a shadow flickered at the edge of the clearing. Instinctively, I froze, my heart thrumming wildly. It was too dark to discern what it was. I called out, but the words felt foreign on my tongue. With each passing second, I felt more trapped in the shrouded, fog-laden woods. And then I heard it again, louder now. The melody twisted into a cacophonous mix of laughter and weeping, a sound that felt like it was piercing the very essence of nature. I stumbled back, my feet slipping on the wet earth as I turned to leave, but the path I had come from was inexplicably gone. It was as if the forest had reshaped itself while I was lost in that haunting sound. Panic bubbled within me as I realized the reality that surrounded me was shifting in a way I couldn't comprehend. I tried walking in the opposite direction, but the trees loomed densely, blocking my way with their gnarled branches. Each step resonated in the quiet night, every crack of a twig echoing ominously. The laughter twined through the fog, filling empty spaces and creeping up my spine like icy fingers. As I stumbled deeper into the woods, I thought I saw shadows lurking amongst the trees, flickering just out of sight. "Is anyone there?" I called out again. My voice was swallowed by the darkness. The laughter amplified, and I was nearly paralyzed with fear, yet I realized the maddening sound, while everywhere, was also strangely alluring. I hesitated, torn between fleeing and surrendering to the unearthly serenade. I felt my resolve weakening, each note beckoning me to venture further. And then, from beneath the grasp of ferns, I spotted it, a small, glowing figure hovering at the edge of the mist. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, radiating warmth and light that held an unnerving, magnetic pull. As I approached, the figure transformed, becoming a wispy, human-like silhouette with eyes that glimmered like the stars above. "Stay with us," it whispered, voice melodic yet chilling. I felt terror meld with a strange yearning, and the ground beneath me shifted, beckoning me to step forward and embrace whatever this entity embodied. I jerked back, heart pounding, desperately looking for an escape. It crouched closer, an expression of deep longing etched across its face, making it impossibly sympathetic. "You've forgotten," it murmured, and I realized the laughter had shifted to a soft, sorrowful tune now. "You've forgotten your connection to nature." Time ceased to exist as I grappled with its words. Memories began flooding in, camping trips with my family, running barefoot on wet grass, the thrill of climbing my first tree. As the shock of nostalgia hit me, the shadows danced closer, melding with the glow of the figure. "Please," it whispered again, a plea that felt more like a demand. "We need you. Nature needs you." Suddenly, a rush of voices surrounded me, each whisper wrapping around my limbs like vines. It was a symphony of nature and magic, intrinsically linked to my past and present, reminding me of who I once was. I fell to my knees, engulfed in that tumultuous blend of fear and yearning. "What do you want from me?" I choked out, overwhelmed by the force of nature's call. "To remember," the figure said, and as it stretched its hand toward me, shadows collided with the light, flooding the air with every essence of beauty and terror I had ever felt. I reached out, feeling the surge of life fill my veins, and grasped its hand. But then, just as quickly, the forest erupted. A whirlwind of light and shadow burst around me, the laughter transforming into cries of anguish. I felt torn between two worlds, the vibrant life I had ignored and the haunting, skeletal grip of the encroaching darkness. "No," I shouted, and as I withdrew my hand, the shadows clawed at me, stifling that fading connection, pulling every piece of me back to their depths. My heart pounded as I ran, instinct overpowering thought as I plunged through the chaos. I sprinted with sheer desperation, branches clawing at my skin, the trees seeming to shift in and out of focus. I didn't stop until I burst out of the woods, gasping for breath, collapsing onto the gravel path of the nearby road. Behind me, the forest stood like a dark sentinel, a silent guardian bearing witness to my fear. Shaking and terrified, I lay there, my mind swirling in disbelief. The laughter, the whispers, the compelling pull, all of it seemed so vivid. I could still hear the last phrase echoing in my mind, "You've forgotten your connection to nature." As I waited for help by the roadside, I vowed never to forget again. I returned home that night with a deep newfound appreciation for nature, its undeniable beauty and its dark mysteries. No longer was I just a city dweller. I understood that in forgetting nature, I had lost a piece of myself. While I never returned to that exact clearing, I found myself hiking more, exploring deeper, engaging with the wild world around me, making peace with its secrets. But sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear the whispers in the wind, calling me to remember. I can't shake the feeling that nature is still watching, waiting for me to truly journey back. I hope that next time, I'll know better than to let go. It was a bleak, rain-soaked evening when I found myself in a small, dimly lit coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a perfect setting for introspection or perhaps a good scare. I'd just finished my shift at the local diner, the clatter of plates and the hum of customers' chatter still echoing in my mind. I ordered a bitter cup of coffee, the kind that seemed to drain the very light from the room, and settled into a corner booth with my laptop, mostly to distract myself from the unsettling thoughts swirling in my mind. The usual crowd was absent, perhaps sheltering from the storm that battered the windows, but in the shadowy corners of the coffee shop, I noticed an older gentleman, his hair wild, beard unkempt, and eyes glimmering with a strange intensity that pulled me in like a lighthouse beacon in the fog. As the minutes turned into an hour, the rain fell harder, creating a rhythmic drumming against the glass that seemed to amplify the silence around us. I couldn't help but steal glances at him. He sat alone, occasionally stirring a murky cup of tea, and every so often, he'd mumble something that I couldn't quite catch. My curiosity piqued as I tried to focus on my work, but the allure of his solitude proved stronger. I found myself leaving my laptop open, half-finished, and venturing closer. It was an impulsive move, one that felt both reckless and intoxicating. "You look like you've got a good story to tell," I said, half-jokingly. The man looked up, fixed his gazes on me with those piercing eyes, and for a moment, the world around us disappeared. "You could say that," he replied, his voice raspy and low, as if he'd been holding on to secrets for longer than I could imagine. I hesitated, the conversation hanging in the air, and finally asked, "What's your story?" He hesitated only a moment before launching into a tale that felt like it had been carefully woven through the threads of time itself. Quickly, I lost track of the space and sound around us, utterly captivated. He began with his childhood, tales of laughter echoing through a bustling household, of loving parents who listened intently to every story he spun, no matter how trivial. I nodded, a part of me envious of the warmth in those memories, but the ambience shifted as the gentleman plunged deeper into his past, a darkness overshadowing his nostalgia. He spoke of how, as he grew up, he felt his voice gradually fading. School became a battlefield, where every attempt to connect would be met with mockery and indifference. There was something haunting in his recounting of moments when he would speak up, only to have his words drowned out by noise. I leaned forward, drawn into his melancholy. Each word resonated with me, as he described the slow disintegration of his ability to share, to express. He revealed that he had once been an aspiring writer, but the rejection letters piled up over time, and with each one, he felt smaller, lesser, words turned into a prison. My heart went out to him, and I found myself silently wishing I could take those moments back, give him the encouragement he so desperately craved. But there was one night, he continued, a flicker of light returning to his weary eyes. I was alone, on a bridge, the city sprawling beneath me, a million lives buzzing unaware of my existence. I was ready to let go, to silence everything forever. But then, I heard something. My stomach twisted in apprehension, urging me to listen closer. "A voice," he whispered, a soft voice carried by the wind. It wasn't just any voice, it was a woman's voice, singing. I turned, hoping to see her, but there was nothing. Just a cold breeze. Yet, that voice was full of such warmth, such depth. It wrapped around me like a blanket, and I realized, she was listening. She heard me in my silence. My breath caught as he spoke. Something deep within stirred, and I could feel tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, the intensity of his revelation washing over me. "From that moment," he said, "I grasped the power of listening. It's not just a passive act, it's an active investment in someone's story. The very act of truly listening can save a life." Each pause, each tremor in his voice, resonated with truth, yet there was something inexplicable about the way he looked past me, as if he could see all the people who had ever wandered through his life, each one a thread in the elaborate tapestry he was trying to weave. The coffee shop remained unchanged around us, time froze, and the storm outside grew more tumultuous, almost in harmony with the emotions we shared in that cloud of intimacy. I finally mustered the courage to ask, "Did you ever find her? The one who was singing?" A shadow crossed his face, darkening his features. "I never did. But her songs stayed with me. It reminds me, everyone has a story, a heartbeat that deserves to be acknowledged. If we just listen." I could hardly breathe, the weight of his words settled within me, enveloping me in both sorrow and hope. And every so often, I find that if I listen hard enough, I can still hear her song. It was surreal. Just an old man sharing his burdens over bitter coffee, yet I felt like I was grasping the intangible threads of connection, the fabric of humanity itself. As he continued to unravel his life, I realized that my own fears and insecurities paled in comparison to the depths of his struggles. A reflection of our shared humanity shone brightly in that tiny, rain-soaked coffee shop. Hours passed like minutes, and I was transported away from my own worries, my job, my loneliness, my day-to-day drudgeries. Here was a man who had battled the silence, who had come to understand the beautiful act of listening and its power to unlock the darkest corners of despair. As the night wore on and the storm finally began to ebb, he paused and glanced at his watch. "I should go," he murmured, as if he had just broken free from a spell. I felt the pull of reality returning like the tide rolling in, overwhelming with the rush of adrenaline and dread. "Will I see you again?" The moment hung heavy in the air, charged with the weight of unspoken words. "Perhaps," he said softly, "but remember this, my friend, never underestimate the power of listening. It can change lives." He rose and walked toward the exit, as if gravity had finally released him. I stared after him as he faded into the night, the bell above the door jingling softly. I sat in the coffee shop long after he left, a bittersweet ache filling my heart, the lonely quietness of the room echoing his parting words. It was true, I had spent my life so busy talking, sharing my own stories, drowning out the voices crying for attention. I was simply looking for someone to listen to me, while failing to see that the world was made richer by the stories of others. I finally closed my laptop, the words left untyped, an unspoken promise etched into my heart. The storm had let up. I stepped outside into the damp, crisp air, filled with renewed purpose. I began to walk, determined to carry forth the lesson I learned that night, to listen, to hear the songs of those around me. And as I strolled through the silent streets, the world pulsated with stories yet to be discovered. I would honor that gentleman's legacy, one heartbeat at a time. Little did I know, he had already begun to etch a significant mark on my life and perhaps the lives of others too, all by simply sharing his heartfelt moment and reminding me of the transformative power of listening. When I learned to appreciate my parents' sacrifices, it was not through some heartwarming moment over a family dinner or a sappy television show. No, it was a dark, desperate time that forced me to confront the weight of their struggles and the extent of their love. I always thought I had a typical middle-class upbringing. I attended school, went to soccer practice, and spent Saturdays lazing around, playing video games while my parents bustled about with their daily routines. They worked hard, but I never really grasped the magnitude of their sacrifices. It was during my sophomore year of college, a time when the world finally started feeling big and overwhelming, that everything changed. I had just finished a particularly rough week filled with exams and an exhausting part-time job, and on that fateful Friday night, I decided to hit a local bar with my friends to blow off steam. That's when I received the call, the kind that throttles your insides like a vice. My mom's voice trembled on the other end, a mixture of fear and sadness rippling through her words. Dad had been in a car accident, they were taking him to the hospital, and I needed to come home. The drive back felt like a fever dream, hours stretching as I replayed memories of my dad, the way he threw me in the air when I was little, the stories he told each night before bed, how he taught me to ride a bike with nothing but patience and that unmistakable grin of his. I arrived at the hospital, heart racing, and I'll spare you the gruesome details, but we didn't know if he was going to make it. It was a blur of sterile rooms and waiting areas filled with anxious faces. I sat, pacing, my fingers digging into my skin, wondering how this could happen to such a good man. The doctors did everything they could, and after an agonizing 24 hours, they finally let us see him, bandaged, bruised, but alive. That night, as I sat in his hospital room, I tried to wrap my head around what had happened. It should have been a simple drive, but it was a reminder of how fragile life is, and I couldn't help but resent the universe a little for putting us in this situation. Days passed, and as he slowly recovered, we talked more. At first, it was about trivial things, and then, somehow, the conversation turned to sacrifices. Dad recounted stories from his own childhood, growing up in a poor neighborhood, working multiple jobs to pay for college, the struggles my grandparents faced as immigrants looking for a better life. Each tale seemed to tether me closer, connecting the dots between his past and the life I had inherited, a life infused with countless unseen sacrifices. I listened, and the weight of it all began to flood over me. I realized that every time he had insisted I should focus on my studies, it wasn't just parental nagging, it was his attempt to ensure that I wouldn't have to face the same struggles he did, that I might find a way to climb higher, beyond their sacrifices. The layers of their love, unpeeled one by one, revealed a depth I had often taken for granted. My parents had worked endless hours, seldom indulging, saving every dime for my education, worrying silently about bills while still managing to put a plate of food on the table and a smile on their faces. I saw their financial struggles in a different light, no longer just a matter of numbers but representative of their unwavering love for me. They fought through their own pain to nurture my growth, encouraging my dreams while silently burying their own disappointments. The more we talked, the more I began to see my own life as a tapestry woven with their sacrifices. A small harrowing incident happened one night, while I was at home caring for my dad during his recovery. Half asleep on the couch beside him, I was awoken by a sudden cough, only to witness him fumbling for his medication that he had clumsily dropped on the floor. I rushed to his aid, but as I kneeled, I caught a glimpse of his weary eyes. It dawned on me, every ache and pain he hid was a product of years spent toiling for our family, yet here he was, determined to show up for me, even in his fragile state. In that moment, it was like a storm broke inside me. I gripped his hand tightly, this time not out of fear but to ground myself in the present, in the recognition of all he had sacrificed. The next weekend, after he was discharged, I returned to campus, but everything felt different. Instead of scrolling through social media or zoning out in classes, I was stirred by an urgency to reach out. I called my mom, thanking her for juggling work, the home, everything so beautifully, often while I was oblivious to how demanding it really was. I promised to come home more, to genuinely listen, to be present. I began volunteering in community service, realizing that there were countless families like mine, whose stories stayed buried beneath layers of daily struggles. I took those journeys home more frequently, sometimes just to sit in the kitchen with my parents as they cooked, savoring every laugh, every moment. We might not have much in terms of material wealth, but I arrived at a realization that our family was richer than most in love and resilience. Eventually, I returned to university, transformed. My grades improved, yes, but more importantly, I was less distracted by the trivialities of college life. I found new purpose in achieving my dreams, not just for myself but also for my parents, to honor the sacrifices they made. When I walked across the stage at graduation, I searched for them in the crowd, and instead of just acknowledging their efforts in a speech, I planned to take them on a trip, a promise I kept. Looking back, the accident was a stark moment that unveiled the complexities of love within sacrifice. A veil had been lifted, allowing me to appreciate everything my parents endured. It wasn't just a wake-up call, it was a rebirth of sorts, a realization that life is not about living for oneself, but about embracing the opportunities in every experience. Now, my parents are my beacon. They remind me that to appreciate truly means to understand the depths from which love arises, and now I live my life not just for myself but for them, always. I share this not just to recount that harrowing time but to inspire anyone who feels distant from their family. Listen, truly listen, you might discover the sacrifices, and the love, that bind you together are far greater than you ever imagined. I wasn't expecting to find anything significant that day. It all started out like a normal Saturday, the kind where you just want to lounge around, maybe watch some movies or play video games. But when I woke up late in the afternoon, I realized I had a laundry basket full of dirty clothes that needed to be taken care of. So, begrudgingly, I hopped in my car and headed to the laundromat down the street. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 90s, with flickering fluorescent lights and oversized machines that wheezed and rattled as they worked. As I loaded my clothes into the washer, I noticed a woman sitting in the corner, hunched over a stack of papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. I'd seen her around, she came in often, always with that same intense look. I judged her silently, thinking, what could be so difficult about doing laundry? But she caught me staring and offered a thin smile, a gesture I quickly returned, albeit awkwardly. When my machine was full, I sat down at the row of seats opposite her, waiting for the cycle to finish. As I scrolled through my phone, I couldn't help but take glances at her. A few minutes later, she suddenly slammed her papers onto the table with a frustrated sigh, and I was jolted from my distraction. I could see now that the papers were filled with sketches and notes, some sort of project that was clearly stressing her out. I felt a twinge of sympathy, so I dared to ask, "Is everything okay?" She looked up at me, surprised, her blue eyes cutting through the dim light of the laundromat. It's just this presentation for work. I'm an architect, trying to design a community center, but every idea I sketch isn't translating the way I want. I nodded, not really knowing what to say. I had no artistic skills whatsoever and couldn't fathom the level of work that went into something like that. Why not just take a break? I suggested half-heartedly, not thinking it would mean much. But her response took me off guard. If I take a break, it feels like I'm giving up. You know how hard it is to be taken seriously in my field? There's no room for weakness. I started to respond, but instead, I found myself staring at her sketches, the lines flowing but imprecise, the vision blurring before me, much like her expression. At that moment, something clicked in my mind. I had been feeling lost in my own life, stuck in a job I hated, going through the motions without a clear direction. This woman's struggle was like a mirror that reflected my own. I decided to be more open. I get that pressure. I'm just a graphic designer, but I feel like everything I create never lives up to my expectations either. This moved her, and she leaned forward a little, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. Really? That's kind of surprising. I mean, artistry is subjective. Isn't it easier to just create because it makes you happy? I chuckled, almost a scoff. You'd think, but it's hard when you're constantly comparing yourself to others. Social media is the worst for that. Seeing other designers' perfect work all the time makes you feel inadequate. She smirked. Welcome to the world of architecture. It's like everyone thinks they're an expert when they see a finished building. They forget that it came from flaws, late nights, and complete breakdowns. We both chuckled at that, as a sense of understanding passed between us. Her humor was infectious, and for the first time that day, I felt like I might not be alone in my feelings of inadequacy. As our conversation continued, she shared how she found herself overthinking everything, how she had taken years to learn to trust her instincts. It's hard, but I've learned that every setback is a chance to reassess, she said. Sometimes, the best ideas come from mistakes. I absorbed her words, as they resonated deep within me. I realized then how much I had been holding myself back, how fear of failure had paralyzed my own creativity. Just as I was starting to feel inspired, the washing machine beeped, interrupting our moment. I rushed to transfer my clothes to the dryer while she prepared to leave. Just before she walked out, she paused, looking back at me. Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. Don't let comparison steal your joy. And with that, she disappeared through the laundromat's door. I stood there, stunned as I felt her words sink deep into my bones. I finished my laundry, feeling lighter somehow, almost renewed. On my drive home, I suddenly had a rush of ideas for my own work, things I had buried under self-doubt. I pulled out my sketchbook and started drafting designs on the side of the road, the urge to create overtaking me. I spent the next few days pouring myself into projects, no longer tethered by the need for validation. It felt liberating. Then, about a week later, I returned to the laundromat, hoping to see her again. I wanted to thank her, share my progress. Everything had changed because of that moment we shared. Yet, when I arrived, the seats were empty, and she was nowhere to be found. I asked the older attendant if she had seen the woman, and with a puzzled frown, he shook his head. Not around here, kid. I don't remember anyone like that. Confused and disappointed, I left, feeling like I had been chasing a ghost. Weeks passed, and I continued to refine my work, slowly gaining confidence. I even took part in a local art show, where I displayed the work that had been inspired by that chance encounter. The community center project I created took home the prize for innovation, and I felt pride swell inside me. I always wondered about that woman, wondered if she was real or a figment of my imagination. Then one evening, out of the blue, while I was scrolling through social media, I found an article featuring an upcoming community center project. The picture was of her drawings, the very same sketches I had seen that day at the laundromat. The headline read, "Local architect overcomes self-doubt to inspire community designs." I felt my heart race. The article featured her story, detailing her struggles, her journey of failure, but ultimately triumph. I was ecstatic for her success but utterly confused about the nature of our encounter. I read the piece several times, trying to piece everything together, feeling like I was in some parallel universe. After finishing, I thought about how much I needed that conversation, how it had propelled both of us in different ways. It reminded me that life lessons often come when you least expect them, from people you might never see again. I don't know if I'll ever cross paths with her again, but I'm thankful for the moment in that dimly lit laundromat. It was there, surrounded by the mundane, that I encountered the extraordinary truth that failure doesn't define us, it's the courage to keep going that ultimately shapes our path. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost, remember, inspiration can be found in the most unexpected places. Even if it's a laundromat on a nondescript Saturday afternoon. How I overcame my fear of heights, an adventure. I've always had a deep, gnawing fear of heights. It wasn't just discomfort, either, it was a paralyzing, gut-wrenching dread that kept me glued to the ground, miles away from anything higher than a second-floor balcony. I couldn't even look down from a tall building without my stomach twisting, my palms sweating, and my heart hammering so loudly I could feel it in my throat. The mere thought of being on the edge, looking down at the endless drop below, was enough to make me feel faint. It was irrational, I knew that, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. Over the years, I'd learned to live with it. I avoided anything that could trigger it, always finding excuses to skip activities like rock climbing or even roller coasters. My friends knew about it, my family knew about it, and I had no intention of ever confronting it head-on. That all changed one summer when my best friend, Alex, convinced me to join him on a hiking trip in the mountains. I hadn't expected him to choose a trail with sheer cliffs and precarious ledges. He'd assured me it would be a straightforward hike, one that stayed within the forest's thick cover, far from the edges that made my heart race. But as we trekked higher, I noticed the trees thinning, the air growing cooler, and the path narrowing until it became clear that we'd soon be crossing open, exposed terrain with dizzying views of the valley below. I wanted to turn back, every fiber of my being was screaming at me to find a reason to go back down, to wait at the campsite for Alex to finish on his own. But something held me back, maybe it was the way he looked at me, his expression mixed with encouragement and a challenge he didn't even have to say out loud. He knew I was terrified, yet he believed I could do this. I told myself I'd give it a try, that I'd go as far as I could and stop if it got to be too much. The first real test came when we reached a narrow path carved into the side of the mountain, with nothing but a metal railing between us and a steep drop hundreds of feet below. My legs felt weak just looking at it, and my vision blurred as I gripped the railing, afraid to move any further. Alex was calm, guiding me to breathe slowly, in and out, grounding me with his voice. He showed me how to focus on each step, not on the void beside us. I kept my gaze on the rocky ground, refusing to look down, trying to ignore the knowledge that the only thing separating me from that empty space was a thin metal bar that felt flimsy and insufficient. Step by step, I made it across, feeling my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. The adrenaline was overwhelming, but as I reached the end of the section, something inside me shifted. It was as if a tiny spark of confidence ignited in my chest, a small flicker of pride that I hadn't given in to the fear. I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I could handle a little more. Alex seemed to sense this, too, and he urged me onward, his own excitement contagious. We continued up the trail, each step taking us closer to the summit, and each time I felt the fear creeping back in, I'd focus on his voice, on the steady rhythm of my breathing, reminding myself that I'd made it this far and I could keep going. As we climbed higher, the views became more expansive, and I couldn't help but glance over at the breathtaking panorama that stretched out before us. The valleys, the rivers winding through the green forest, the distant peaks shrouded in mist, it was all so beautiful, yet so terrifying. But I couldn't bring myself to look away. There was a strange sense of awe mingling with the fear, a feeling I'd never experienced before. It was as if the height itself was pulling me out of my comfort zone, forcing me to confront the part of myself that had always held me back. We finally reached a plateau near the summit, where the cliff dropped sharply away into open space. Alex suggested we sit down for a while to catch our breath and take in the view. My instinct was to stay far from the edge, to keep my back pressed against the solid rock behind me, but a stronger part of me felt compelled to sit closer, to inch toward the edge and see the world spread out beneath me. I lowered myself onto the rock, legs stretched out in front of me, and looked down. My heart pounded, my hands shook, but I forced myself to keep looking, to let the fear wash over me without pulling back. I focused on the details, the texture of the rock beneath me, the way the wind felt on my face, the patterns of trees and rivers far below. And as I sat there, something incredible happened. The fear was still there, but it didn't feel as overpowering. It was as if I'd found a way to coexist with it, to acknowledge it without letting it control me. In that moment, I felt a sense of freedom I'd never experienced before, a sense of strength and resilience I didn't know I had. I realized that the fear of heights was a part of me, but it didn't have to define me. I could choose to face it, to live alongside it, and in doing so, I could finally see the world from a new perspective, one that had always been out of reach. Alex noticed the change in my expression, the calmness that had replaced the panic, and he gave me a knowing smile. "See? You did it," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. We sat there in silence for a while, just taking it all in, the mountains, the sky, the sheer vastness of the world around us. As we made our way back down the trail, I felt like a different person, someone who had faced one of their greatest fears and come out stronger on the other side. It wasn't a perfect victory, and I knew that my fear of heights wouldn't disappear overnight. But I had proven to myself that I could confront it, that I could push past the limits I'd imposed on myself. When I discovered my passion, a journey of self-discovery. I didn't expect my life to change at a random open mic night, but that's exactly what happened. I was dragged there by my friend Sarah, who swore it was the best way to shake off my so-called funk. My funk, as she called it, was the rut I'd been stuck in since graduating college, with a degree I didn't care about and a job I hated even more. That night, the small cafe was packed with people, a mix of regulars and first-timers like us, all crammed into mismatched chairs around tiny tables. The stage was just a wooden platform lit by a single spotlight, and the air smelled of coffee and cinnamon. I wasn't in the mood for poetry or amateur guitar players, but Sarah was persistent, so I sipped my latte and kept my eyes on the door, fantasizing about a quick escape. Then, the host announced a spoken-word artist named Max. He was a lanky guy with wild hair and a nervous smile, clutching a crumpled notebook as he walked up to the microphone. I rolled my eyes, expecting something pretentious or overly dramatic, but within seconds of him starting, I was hooked. Max spoke about ordinary things, morning commutes, grocery shopping, awkward conversations, but the way he turned these mundane experiences into something profound left me speechless. He painted pictures with his words, weaving humor and heartbreak in a way that felt personal and universal all at once. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside me, a mix of awe and envy. When Max finished, the applause was thunderous, and I found myself clapping louder than anyone else. I couldn't stop thinking about his performance for days. I started Googling spoken-word videos, watching everything I could find. Each poem I listened to felt like a new layer of my soul was being peeled back. I remembered how, as a kid, I used to scribble little stories and poems in a notebook I kept hidden under my bed. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost that spark, burying it under practicality and the need to grow up. Inspired, I dug through old boxes in my closet until I found that notebook, its pages yellowed and brittle. Reading my childhood poems felt like reconnecting with a forgotten part of myself. They were rough, full of cliches and clumsy rhymes, but they were mine. I decided to try writing again, not for anyone else, but for me. At first, it was awkward. The words felt stiff, like I was trying too hard, but I kept at it. Every lunch break at work, I'd sit in the corner of the cafeteria with a notebook, scribbling whatever came to mind. Slowly, the stiffness faded, and the words began to flow. I wrote about everything, my frustrations, my dreams, the little moments that made up my days. It was like a dam had burst, and I couldn't stop. After weeks of writing in secret, Sarah found one of my poems on the coffee table and begged me to read it aloud. I was mortified, but her enthusiasm was contagious. She convinced me to sign up for the same open mic night we'd gone to, and I spent the next 2 weeks rehearsing my poem in front of the mirror until I could recite it without stumbling. When the night came, I was a nervous wreck. My palms were sweaty, and my heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Sarah dragged me to the cafe, promising it would be fun, but all I could think about was how much I wanted to run. My name was called, and I walked up to the stage on trembling legs. The spotlight was blinding, and I could barely see the audience. I gripped the microphone, my voice shaking as I began. But then, something amazing happened. As I spoke, the fear melted away. The words felt alive, each one pulling me deeper into the moment. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then the room erupted in applause. I'd never felt anything like it, the rush of sharing something so personal and having it resonate with others. That night, Max approached me and told me he loved my poem. We talked for hours, and he invited me to join a local writing group he was part of. I started going to their weekly meetings, where I met people who shared my passion for words. They became my support system, pushing me to take risks and refine my craft. Over the next year, I performed at more open mic nights, entered poetry slams, and even published a few pieces in local magazines. My job was still soul-crushing, but writing gave me a reason to get through the day. Eventually, I decided to take a leap of faith. I quit my job and started freelancing, writing copy for small businesses during the day and working on my poetry at night. It wasn't easy, but for the first time, I felt like I was living authentically. My journey wasn't just about discovering my passion, it was about rediscovering myself. Writing taught me to see the beauty in the everyday, to find meaning in the chaos of life. And it all started with one night, one poem, and the courage to chase a spark that had been buried for too long. It was a bleak winter evening when I stepped out of my apartment, the wind howling like a lost soul, and my breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. I was on my way to meet a friend for dinner, just a casual outing to distract me from the monotony of my life. As I walked down the dimly lit street, a flicker of movement caught my eye in the shadows of a nearby alley. Curiosity tugged at me, and against my better judgment, I turned to investigate. Peering into the darkness, I spotted a figure crouched by a dumpster, shivering and wrapped in what looked like a tattered blanket. An unsettling feeling crept over me. It was that age-old internal struggle, should I help or just walk away? After all, I had a dinner to catch. But something about the scene pulled me in like a moth to a flame, and before I knew it, I was stepping closer. As I approached, the figure jolted up, revealing a young woman with wild eyes and tangled hair, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Please, I need help," she stammered, her voice shaky and desperate. I hesitated but couldn't bring myself to leave her there. I asked her what was wrong, and she explained that she had lost everything, her job, her home, and, terrifyingly, her family. The world felt heavy on her shoulders, and somehow, I could see it echoed in her blue eyes. I didn't have much to spare, but I offered her what little money I had in my pocket and asked if she wanted something warm to eat. She nodded with a grateful smile that melted my heart, and together, we walked to a nearby diner. Over steaming bowls of soup, we talked. She introduced herself as Clara, and I learned about her struggles, the suffocating weight of despair that had driven her to the streets. The more she spoke, the more I felt an unexplainable connection with her. As the evening wore on, I felt something shift in the air, an electricity of shared experience that made it feel as though fate had intertwined our lives, even if only for this singular moment. I had no idea what was coming next. After we finished our meal, I suggested that she stay with me for a night. I lived alone, and something in my gut told me that leaving her alone would be a mistake. Clara initially hesitated but eventually relented, though I could see the flicker of distrust in her eyes. Arriving at my apartment, I offered her a shower and some clothes I'd long outgrown. Watching her transform from a weary, beaten figure into someone who looked like they might actually smile again was the most beautiful thing I had witnessed in ages. We sat on my couch, and she shared more stories, about her dreams, her photography career that had crumbled under the pressures of life. As she spoke, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Sitting there, listening to her passion reignite, made me realize I hadn't truly felt alive in a long time. Hours slipped away as we exchanged laughter, fears, and insecurities. With each shared moment, Clara and I became something like friends, and with that connection, I moved from simply feeling pity to a strange, fierce desire to help her any way I could. I know it was irrational. After all, I had barely known her for a few hours. My instincts strongly warned against getting too close, that there was danger mingling with benevolence in this new situation. But my heart whispered otherwise. When we finally settled in and the adrenaline started to fade, I suggested the idea of a photography exhibition to Clara. Inspired by her stories, I thought it would be an incredible way for her to share her experiences and struggles. She lit up at the thought, her creative spirit reigniting before my very eyes. Just as we began planning the logistics, the laughter faded, replaced by a heavy silence as we both felt the gravity of our lives. Around midnight, I offered Clara a couple of blankets and a place on my couch to sleep, feeling a wave of protectiveness wash over me as she nestled in, her face softening in a dreamlike expression. Once I turned off the lights, a wave of anxiety crashed over me. Here I was, letting a stranger stay in my apartment. But whatever unease gnawed at me was overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose. I had to help her rise above the storm. Just as I was sealing myself away in my bedroom, I heard an unexpected rustle from the living room. A surge of adrenaline shot through me as I rushed out, half expecting to find a thief or worse, only to find Clara standing by the window, staring out into the dark abyss of the street below. "I'm sorry," she said, startled, "I didn't mean to wake you." But there was something off about her demeanor, shadows flickering across her face, and as I moved closer, I realized she wasn't looking out at the street. She was staring reflexively into the darkness as if searching for something lurking beyond the veil. "What are you looking for?" I asked. She turned to face me, her eyes wide and haunting. "I don't know," she mumbled, her voice trembling. "I just have a feeling. I can feel it coming." That's when my heart stopped. I felt an inexplicable chill crawl up my spine, not from the cold outside, but something more sinister. I don't know what compelled me, but I grabbed her hand and quietly led her back to the couch, my instincts roaring at me to protect her. We sat there in silence, the tension thick between us, shadows lengthening in the dim light. But once again, she smiled, a small, fragile spark that lit up the room. I knew then that I wouldn't just let her go back to the streets anymore. I was invested in her journey, and in whatever strange bond had formed between us. As the night dragged on, we eventually settled into comfortable silence, a blanket of mutual understanding enveloping us, until sleep finally took us both. The next morning was bright and cold, but a warmth surged through me as I woke up to find Clara already awake, fiddling with her phone. I smiled, however, when she glanced at me and broke into a genuine smile. "I have an idea," she said, excitement dancing in her eyes. "Let's do more than just an exhibition, let's document the stories of people like me and share them. We could do a zine, and I'll take photos of everyone we meet." And just like that, the little project ignited into enthusiasm, a fire that burned bright against the fading memories of despair. Over the next few weeks, something miraculous happened. Clara and I became a team, exploring the city, meeting people, capturing their life stories, their hopes, dreams, and resilience. It was almost surreal, feeding their histories through her camera and into our collective being. Clara's zest for life was infectious, and soon, she became the artist she always wanted to be. I, too, was transformed. The darkness I had felt closeting away with my mundane routine dissipated in her presence. It became a life-changing experience, not just for Clara, but for myself as well. But just as life began to shine, an inescapable shadow began to loom over us. Cold breezes rustled through the air, and soon Clara became withdrawn again. I noticed her gazing out the window at odd hours, the same anxious look in her eyes. I did my best to reassure her, but our new routine was starting to make her restless. One evening, she burst into tears, pouring out her fears about revealing her past through the zine and how it might reflect on the people she cared for the most. "What if they hate me?" she cried. "What if they think I'm just that girl they always saw on the streets?" I held her close as the words drowned out the louder fears creeping inside me. Somehow, we made it through that dark patch, finishing the first issue of our zine. It was a heartfelt testament to struggle and triumph, and honestly, it went viral. We received testimonials from people encouraging us and even donations. I watched Clara flourish, her past fading from view as she emerged in the sunlight. But, just when it seemed the future could not be brighter, the storm returned. One night, Clara disappeared. I woke up with an odd feeling. The space beside me was cold and empty. Panic sparked in my chest, and I scoured the apartment, my heart thumping loudly in the deafening silence. The moments stretched indefinitely until I finally hit the street, scanning the area frantically. I had to find her, I had to bring her back. I retraced our footprints, every corner and shadow becoming haunted by her absence. After hours that felt like days, I received a frantic text. Clara had been spotted at the alley where I had first found her. It sent chills cascading down my spine. I rushed over, sweat pooling in my palms as shadows danced around me. When I finally stumbled into that alley, I called out her name, a broken whisper splitting the night air. I found her in the very same place we had first met, crouched against the grimy wall, her face streaked with tears. "Clara." I rushed forward, her eyes flaring with fear as she recoiled. "Please don't come closer," she begged. Me, her voice cracking. "I can't stay like this, it's taking over. I can feel it dragging me down again." Just like that old feeling from earlier, despair clawed back at us, vengeful and relentless, suffocating me. "You're not alone anymore," I pleaded, reaching out, but the shadows loomed too large, too intimidating. You can't do this alone. But then she whispered something beneath her breath, a prayer or a mantra, and she abruptly turned away. I felt myself lunging, instinct driving me forward as I grabbed her wrist, pulling her back just as she was about to vanish into the darkness. "What are you doing?" I cried. "We can face this together." That was when I realized the dark shadow was not just a metaphor anymore, it was alive and vivid in her fear, a tangible darkness that threatened to consume her whole. "Let me go," she screamed. "You don't understand, it already has me." And for a moment, I felt the weight of that truth in my bones, the darkness that had haunted her had come for me as well. Fear fought within me, but holding her tight brought a surge of warmth, courage I hadn't known I possessed. "I won't let it win," I shouted, igniting a strength full of prayer. "Not now, not ever." Rolling waves of energy surged around as tears streamed down Clara's face, and in that moment, our connection glowed brighter than the doubt lurking in the streets. The shadows lurked, but we wouldn't let it consume us. It was an unshakable promise I made with every ounce of my being as I held on tightly, feeling her fight slowly begin to resonate again. And as if by some miracle, the darkness started to recede, retreating back into its corners as our laughter echoed through the alley. We did it together. We weren't just survivors, we were warriors battling the darkness, taking the first step toward the light. And from that day, we faced each struggle head-on, together. Clara's photography displayed at local galleries, her voice rising above the din that once silenced her. We became advocates for others like us, helping share stories that would brighten the faces of those still lost in darkness. If I had never stopped to help a stranger in need that cold winter night, I wouldn't have recognized life's infinite capacity for change. That night sparked a life-changing journey, one that grew into a meaningful tapestry of hope, light, and connection. In every moment, we breathed and created beauty where there was once only despair. And that's the time I helped a stranger in need. It changed everything. I've always considered myself an easygoing person, the type who avoids confrontation like the plague, always retreating into the shadows when someone attempted to dominate the conversation or push their opinions on me. I was used to sacrificing my own wants for the sake of others' happiness. But everything changed one cold night in October, the night I took a stand for myself and found a sliver of empowerment that I never knew existed in me. It was a Thursday, and I walked into a local bar, an ordinary place where my friends and I would hang out after work. As I entered, the warmth of the dim lighting and the sound of soft laughter washed over me, a welcome contrast to the chill outside. I weaved my way to a corner booth where my friends were already gathered, drinks in hand and animatedly discussing their week. I took a seat, smiling at their stories, trying to blend in, but I felt an unsettling darkness creeping over the atmosphere, an almost palpable tension. I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just the weight of the week settling on my shoulders. As the night wore on, things started to unravel. A group of guys entered the bar, loud, boisterous, full of bravado. It was obvious they were out for a good time, and I thought nothing of it until one of them, a burly guy with a booming laugh, made his way to our table. He seemed harmless at first, exchanging pleasantries, but then he turned his focus to Sarah, one of my friends, and it felt like a switch flipped in the atmosphere. He leaned in closer, conversing with her, his conversational style bordering on invasive. I could see Sarah's discomfort as he leaned over, getting too close, his inappropriate jokes thinly veiled as flattery. I watched, frozen, my heart racing as she squirmed under his gaze. I wanted to say something, to intervene, but the words caught in my throat. It was like a tidal wave was crashing against me, and I was helplessly adrift on the surface. My friends tried to interject, but each time they spoke, the guy brushed off their concerns with a careless chuckle, clearly relishing the control he seemed to have over the situation. I felt sick to my stomach. After what felt like an eternity, he finally backed off, but not before leaving a visible mark on the night. Sarah learned her lesson that night, to be more wary of strangers, to expect the worst. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had somehow failed her, failed myself, and that's when I realized I had had enough. I wasn't going to let myself be a bystander anymore. You see, growing up, I was taught that confrontation was bad, that keeping the peace was honorable, but was it really? Did it matter if I kept the peace while my insides churned, and my blood boiled? That's when I decided, in a moment of adrenaline-fueled clarity, to take a stand for myself. I couldn't let this feeling go without confronting it, and I couldn't let future encounters like this slip through the cracks again. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked toward the group that had momentarily veered the night off course. I was met with ridicule and laughter, their calls echoing in my ears, but I pushed through the anxiety that threatened to bolt me back to my seat. "Hey," I yelled, my voice shaking but surprisingly loud. "What the hell is wrong with you?" If I thought I was prepared for their response, I was sorely mistaken. The laughter immediately died down, and their faces twisted into expressions of surprise. I couldn't believe the words that were coming out of my mouth, the assertiveness that was coursing through me. It was intoxicating, almost surreal. The burly guy slammed his pint down and turned to me, his face suddenly aggressive. "Who the hell do you think you are, little girl?" The line cut me, but it also fueled me. "I'm the one telling you to back off. You think it's funny to make someone uncomfortable? It's disgusting." The weight of the bar shifted, and a few patrons turned to watch the mounting drama unfold. The guy's friends laughed nervously, unsure of how to react. In that moment, I felt a rush of empowerment coursing through my veins, an electrifying clarity that screamed for justice. I was terrified, but that fear transformed into a warm kind of adrenaline. "You think you can come in here and disrespect women like that? You need to learn some manners," I continued, my voice gaining strength, surprising even myself. "You're not funny. You're pathetic." I felt a camaraderie growing in the space, the other patrons catching on to the moment, murmurs of agreement rippling through the bar. The guy stood there frozen, a mixture of surprise and anger flooding his features. At that very moment, Sarah and my friends rallied behind me, an unspoken support that fortified my resolve. He spat back some half-hearted retort, but his bravado was fading, the air growing heavier with the reality of confrontation. The bartender, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached and threw her arms across her chest. "If you can't start respecting people in here, I'll have to kick you out." It was a perfect moment of empowerment, solidarity in a room that had felt heavy moments earlier. The guy scoffed and turned away, leaving his friends looking sheepish, as if he had just dropped a hot coal among a bunch of flowers. I felt a rush of exhilaration. I had finally spoken up for what I believed was right. The bar started to settle down, laughter returning cautiously along with the echoes of casual conversations. I turned back to my friends, who were beaming with pride, and I realized that I had taken the first of many steps toward owning my voice and asserting myself. Taking a stand that night was about far more than just confronting one loud guy in a bar. It was about reclaiming my space, my right to feel safe, and my right to speak without fear of consequences. I had battled my own demons, and by confronting him, I was able to silence a part of me that had let others walk all over me for way too long. I felt lighter, I felt empowered. I didn't just take a stand for myself, but in that moment, I realized I had taken a stand for all the other women who had ever felt silenced in the wake of arrogance and insensitivity. I left the bar that night with a newfound sense of bravery. Although I was a little shaken, I felt connected to something greater than myself, a wave of empowerment that pushed me to face future challenges head-on. I knew this was just the beginning. I'd finally found my voice, and nobody could take that away. And now, without that night, I wouldn't have recognized the strength within me that had always been there, waiting to rise up and be heard. When I learned to trust my instincts, a life lesson. When I learned to trust my instincts, it wasn't in some quiet, introspective moment of clarity, it was during the most harrowing and surreal experience of my life, one that I still struggle to explain even now. It began on a Friday night when I decided to take the long way home from work. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the weight of the week finally catching up to me or the gnawing feeling that I needed some kind of change, even a minor one. The usual route felt suffocating that evening, and the thought of mindlessly crawling through familiar intersections filled me with a strange unease I couldn't shake. So, I turned left instead of right and found myself driving down a stretch of road I hadn't taken in years. It was darker than I remembered, lined with tall trees that blocked out the moonlight and made the streetlights seem dim and ineffective. My headlights cut through the gloom, and the rhythmic hum of the tires on the pavement was oddly soothing at first. I rolled down the window, letting the crisp night air wash over me, and for a brief moment, I felt lighter, like I'd made the right choice. But then, about 10 minutes into my detour, I noticed something strange, a car behind me, keeping pace. It wasn't unusual to have someone driving in the same direction, but something about the way this car moved set my nerves on edge. It wasn't just following, it was mimicking. If I sped up, it sped up. If I slowed down, it did the same. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just a coincidence, but the longer it went on, the harder it became to dismiss the sinking feeling in my gut. That's when the first real warning bell went off in my head, a voice, quiet but insistent, telling me to turn off the road, to see if the car would follow. I ignored it at first, rationalizing that I didn't want to overreact. But the voice grew louder, more urgent, until I finally gave in and took an abrupt right turn onto a side street. The car followed. My heart rate spiked, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me now, telling me this wasn't normal. I drove for another block, my mind racing, and then made another sudden turn, this time onto a narrow residential street. The car stayed right behind me. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, the kind of place where people locked their doors early and turned off their porch lights by 9. There was no one outside, no one to witness what was happening. I scanned the houses as I drove, searching for anything that might offer me some kind of refuge, a lit window, an open garage, anything. But it was as if the entire world had gone to sleep, leaving me alone with my rising panic. That's when I spotted the park. It was small and unassuming, just a patch of grass with a few benches and a playground, but it was well lit, and for some reason, it felt like a lifeline. I veered into the parking lot and pulled into a space, shutting off my engine and sitting there, heart pounding, as I watched the car glide to a stop at the lot's entrance. It didn't pull in. It just sat there, its headlights cutting through the dark, glaring at me like a predator sizing up its prey. Every fiber of my being was telling me to stay put, to not get out of the car, but then the voice in my head, the same one that had urged me to take the detour, to test if I was being followed, said something I didn't expect: run. It didn't make sense. I was safer in the car, wasn't I? But the voice didn't waver, and neither did the feeling in my gut. So, against all logic, I grabbed my phone and my keys and bolted from the car, sprinting across the park toward the far side where the houses were closer together. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my legs pumping harder than they had in years. When I reached the edge of the park, I ducked behind a row of bushes and crouched there, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching on gravel, slow and deliberate. Someone had gotten out of the car. My chest tightened, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle the sound of my breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were just on the other side of the bushes. I could see the shadow of a figure, tall and imposing, illuminated by the park's lights. My heart felt like it was going to explode, but I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't find me. And then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had appeared, they started to fade. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then crept out from my hiding spot and made a mad dash to the nearest house with a porch light on. I banged on the door, not caring how desperate I looked, and when an older woman finally answered, I practically collapsed into her entryway, trying to explain what had happened. She called the police, and when they arrived, the car was gone. The officers took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. They suggested I take a different route home next time and let me go with a warning to stay vigilant. I never found out who was in that car or what they wanted, but I'm certain that if I hadn't trusted my instincts that night, things could have ended very differently. That voice in my head, the one I'd ignored for so long, saved my life. And now, I listen to it, no matter how irrational or inconvenient it seems. Because sometimes, your gut knows things your mind can't explain, and ignoring it is a risk I'm no longer willing to take. When I discovered a hidden talent I never knew I had, it started like any other uneventful evening. I was at home, curled up on the couch with my dog, Charlie, flicking through streaming channels, trying to find something entertaining to watch. That's when I came across an obscure documentary about the paranormal. The subject captivated me instantly. A group of researchers had set up what they called a ghost communication seance. Before I realized it, I found myself digging deeper into the topic, even scrolling through online forums that discussed experiences with the afterlife. I started to get this inexplicable itch. It was as if the universe was applying pressure on my chest, urging me to explore the supernatural. The more I read, the more fascinated I became with similar experiences shared by people just like me. Late into the night, I discovered a subthread about a local abandoned asylum, one that had a reputation for being haunted. The post claimed that it was possible to communicate with spirits using an antique device known as a spirit box. A voice faintly emerged through a series of static frequencies, allegedly from beyond the grave, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Harmless, right? I thought about the thrill of it all, and an odd sense of adventure washed over me. Over the next couple of weeks, I became consumed with the idea of going out to the asylum. Telling myself it was purely for curiosity, I gathered my courage, invited a couple of friends, and we made plans to explore the place. When the day finally arrived, there was a palpable energy among us, a mix of excitement and horror. It was 2 a.m. when we arrived. The crumbling building loomed before us, silhouetted against the moonlight, casting rays of silver on its weathered facade. Even before we stepped inside, I could feel the weight of the air push down on my chest, thick with anticipation and fear. We set up our equipment, flashlights, cameras, and a phone with a spirit box app I had installed the night before. As soon as we stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically, and Charlie, who had come along for emotional support, began to whine and tug at my leg, clearly sensing something I couldn't. I made a soft joke about him being our spirit detector, trying to lighten the mood, but in my gut, it felt all too real. We wandered through the dark hallways, our footsteps echoing as we split into pairs. Every corner felt alive, the air crawling with unspoken words, and I overheard my friends whispering about ghostly apparitions, which only fueled my adrenaline. My partner in the adventure, Ava, suggested we try the spirit box in the therapy room. The room was lined with old padded chairs, seated on mass-like forgotten sacrifices, seemingly urging us to listen. It was a brilliant idea, and despite my nerves, I felt an overwhelming urge to give it a try. As we flipped the device on, static filled the ominous air, and my heart raced with every crackle. I took a deep breath and said, "Is there anyone here with us?" More static crackled and faded into unintelligible murmurs. Suddenly, the voice calmly cut through, echoing back, "Help." I froze, the sound balling up in my throat. I repeated my question, this time with more intensity. "What do you need help with?" Almost instantly, it replied. The voice was sharper, more insistent, "Find me." My pulse quickened as an overwhelming curiosity took hold. Who was this? Was it a trick of the device, a clever hoax? Or was there something darker at play? We exchanged nervous glances, but before anyone could speak, Ava took my hand and urged me to ask more questions. The conversation spiraled, each answer became more haunting, revealing tragic events from decades past. It spoke about a lost child who had vanished within the asylum's walls. "Where are you?" I asked, feeling an odd connection to this voice. "Behind the blue door." My heart raced. There was a blue door that had been almost completely hidden behind rubble in the corner of the room. Despite everything in my heart screaming to turn back, I suggested we check it out. When we approached the door, the air thickened, laden with the scent of mildew and despair. Ava looked hesitant, but we had come so far, my curiosity drowned her anxiety. The door creaked as I pulled against its stubborn frame, and I felt an electric chill run up my spine. What we found inside was unlike anything I had ever encountered. The room was small, cluttered with old toys and frayed stuffed animals, as if it had been forgotten since the 70s. And then, amid the chaos, I spotted a dusty music box resting in a corner. A peculiar sensation washed over me as I walked towards it, an inexplicable connection drawing me forth. I picked it up and wound the key. To my shock, the haunting melody that emerged filled the air, reverberating with an ethereal quality. It took a moment, but suddenly, the spirit box crackled once more, and the voice returned, this time with an urgency that was almost desperate. "You found me." The air around us shifted. The lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even lower. A rush of coldness enveloped me, and all at once, every hair on my body stood on end. I sensed something was awakening inside the room. It felt close, like a breath brushing across my neck. In a whispered frenzy, Ava pleaded for me to turn off the spirit box, but I couldn't move. My fingers felt glued to the music box. I had an epiphany, a revelation. Playing the music was somehow connecting us more deeply to whatever lingered in the room. As the last notes slipped away, silence fell like a guillotine, heavy and final. Just as I turned to respond to my friends, a rush of cold air lunged past me, stealing my voice. The spirit box held with the frantic energy of 100 voices all clamoring in agony, pleading for release. In that moment, I became acutely aware of my own pulse, thudding like a war drum in my ears. I felt a surge of inexplicable energy flow through my fingers, a violent shiver down my spine that urged me to continue, to ask the questions yearning to be asked. It was almost as if I became a medium for the dead, channeling their cries, their anguish. "What do you want?" I sputtered, feeling as if the shadows were wrapping around me, begging for release. Time blurred. I found myself enveloped in an otherworldly trance. I could hear what felt like thousands of stories spilling from my mouth, and with each beat of the music box, the cries of the damned fell into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was meant to solve. I was overcome, entranced, as I pieced together their tragedies and fears. As I unraveled their stories, the atmosphere shifted, the oppressive weight in the room began to lift, and I was filled with an undeniable sense of purpose, a primal urge to help them find peace. "It's okay. I hear you," I managed to breathe as the energy swirled around us, tilting towards something euphoric. I could feel my friends watching in awe and terror as I became a vessel for the lost. Momentarily exhilarated, I poured out their stories, I shared their pain, their laughter, the unfinished chapters of their lives. It felt electric, and in those moments, I realized I was not merely listening, I was interpreting, transcribing their tragic poetry. When it was finally over, an eerie calm enveloped us. The spirit box fell silent, almost reverent as the shadows grew gentle, retreating into the corners of the room. I felt a weight lift, as if the lost souls were finally at rest. The music box closed gently in my hands, and a sudden, overwhelming exhaustion washed over me. I dropped to my knees, a surge of tears threatening to spill as the emotional weight bore down on me. My friends rushed to help me up, their faces pale as they ushered me out of the asylum, shaking and fumbling with the door behind us, the tension still crackling in the air. We stumbled back into our world, gasping for breath. It felt like surfacing from the depths of a dark ocean. As we left, I felt the profound silence of the building swallow us whole, swallowing the remnants of voices that once cried for help. It wasn't until weeks later that I found myself again at the brink of something great, something terrible. The moment I returned home, I couldn't shake the bizarre connection that had been forged with the unseen. I wasn't simply a spectator, I had been transformed into something far greater than a curious adventurer. I continued to explore this newfound ability, engaging with the paranormal community, hosting small gatherings where I practiced my connection with the spirits. Each time, I felt the energies surrounding me, their whispers guiding me toward revelations I never knew existed, stories I needed to tell. And with every session, the voices grew stronger, more attuned to my presence, as if I were stitching the fabric of their lives to reality once more. Everyone who attended eventually left, captivated, and murmured wonders of the afterlife, almost hypnotized, as they too felt the weight of history through me. But with great power came great responsibility. As I began unveiling truths, seeking solace for these wandering spirits, I felt the symptoms of such intensity ripple through my everyday life. It became harder to separate myself from those who had yet to find rest. It bled into my thoughts and invaded my dreams. I would wake up in a cold sweat, voices echoing throughout the recesses of my mind, their cries a constant reminder that I could never return to who I was before. My hidden talent became a burden, a relentless force that consumed my waking hours. Nights blended into days as the veil between the living and the dead became increasingly blurred, soon leaving me with an insatiable thirst for connection and resolution. The initial rush of excitement transformed into a haunting cycle, a desperate need to free every soul that echoed through my thoughts. It became impossible to breathe without yearning to reach out. Eventually, I unlocked a door within me that should have remained sealed, a residing power that was tethered to the anguish of the afterlife. The irony was that, in uncovering my hidden talent, I unlocked a perpetual nightmare. In my quest to help lost souls find peace, I became trapped, a reluctant gatekeeper of the unseen. I realized that sometimes, it is best to leave the hidden talents undiscovered. Sometimes it's wiser to let those who are stuck remain at rest, for the price of knowing their stories may be your own salvation, or your own undoing. As I look back, reflecting on that fateful encounter at the asylum, I wonder what I might be able to say to that earlier version of myself. Would I warn myself of the burden that lay ahead? Would I carry the music box too, knowing now the power it possesses? Or, would I simply allow the unseen to remain unseen, forgetting the whispers that beckon, knowing that they are no longer just stories but fragments of a darkness I will always carry? No matter how far I run, the talent remains, buried beneath the weight of unsaid farewells, fragments of lives lost, and the knowledge that I will always be tethered, whether I like it or not. And to think, it all began with a single voice calling out for help. I've always been a creature of habit, my life was a monotonous loop of wake, work, eat, sleep. It was nothing out of the ordinary, but one day, I stumbled across a post online about the benefits of morning rituals. Curiosity piqued, I thought, what the hell? And committed to changing my morning routine. The first morning was rough. I woke up an hour earlier, groggy as hell, and stumbled into the kitchen to make some herbal tea instead of my usual coffee. Standing there, sipping on that strange, warm liquid, I felt both lost and strangely liberated. I began to meditate, at least, I attempted to. The first few minutes were filled with my racing thoughts about work and bills, but I persisted, convinced that this was going to be the thing that changed my life. Little did I know, I was stepping into the unknown. After a week of this new routine, something eerie began to happen. I started having dreams, not just any dreams, but vivid, lucid ones. Each night felt like I was drifting into a new layer of reality. I dreamt about a woman behind a red door, beckoning me to come closer. There was something about her. The dreams felt so real that I would wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of her gaze still pressing down on me. The more I committed to my changes, the more pronounced the dreams became. After a few weeks, I recognized that the dreams were connected to my routine. And then came that night, a dream unlike any other. In the dim light of the room, I entered through the red door, finding myself in a long, narrow hallway lined with portraits. Each painting seemed to depict a different version of me, living out alternate realities, lives I could have lived had I made different choices. It was both fascinating and terrifying. I walked down the hallway, looking at each picture, noticing their details, the success, the heartbreak, the victories that could have been. Just as I was absorbing it all, I noticed a flicker at the end of the hall. There she was, the woman from my dreams, standing at the end, longing for me to come closer. My heart raced. Before I could think, I found myself sprinting towards her, and just when I thought I'd reach her, the world around me began to dissolve into a hazy fog. I awoke with a start, my room was dark, and the only light came from the window. I felt an impulse, unlike anything I had ever experienced, compelling me to make a change right then and there. Exhausted but driven, I decided to go for a late-night walk, something I had never done. The streets were deserted, a cold breeze nipped at my skin as I wandered aimlessly. In my head, I replayed that dream, the portraits, the gazes, and most importantly, her. Suddenly, I found myself at the park, a quiet, sprawling place surrounded by trees that spread like festering shadows in the moonlight. Something urged me to the old swing set that creaked faintly with each breeze. I sat down, gripping the cold chains, feeling oddly comfortable. That's when I noticed a figure at the other end of the empty park, a woman standing beneath a flickering street lamp. My heart lurched painfully in my chest. Had she somehow followed me from the dream? It felt impossible, ludicrous even, but the resemblance was uncanny. The same long hair, the same piercing eyes. My instincts screamed to run, to hide, but I was rooted to the swing. She raised her arm slowly, pointing directly at me. The air thickened with an unspeakable tension. I reluctantly stood up, slowly approaching her, my mind racing, wondering if I was entering an entirely new reality. The closer I got, the clearer her features became, and then the world began to spiral. It was as if reality itself was reshaping around me. I staggered as colors swirled, the whole scenery morphed into a kaleidoscopic mess. I heard a voice, smooth but haunting, whispering my name, "You can be more than you are." The voice filled my head, echoing within the abyss of my mind, drowning out my thoughts. And then, I was in front of her, standing inches away, something radiated between us. "You've seen what could be," she said softly. My heart pounded as I stood paralyzed, the world a blur around us. "I can show you another path, a way to escape the cycle you're trapped in." A part of me wanted to reject her offer. What did it mean? Would I lose everything I had achieved, throw away my life for the unknown? But another part of me was willing, desperate for a change. My routine had been my prison, hasn't it? "Yes," I said, almost strangled by my own words. Suddenly, the ground shook, a low rumble that unnerved me. I felt the air crackle with energy as visions whipped around us, flashes of lives I hadn't lived, success, fame, heartbreak, love, the pain and joy of it all, playing out in an endless montage like a movie burned into the fabric of reality. It felt intoxicating. I could feel myself unraveling, pieces of me scattering into the infinite possibilities before me. Everything blurred, and in an instant, I was swept away, leaving fragments of my old self behind, welcoming the unknown with open arms. I awoke the next morning in my own bed, drenched in sweat, a pounding in my head. Nothing seemed different at first, just my familiar surroundings. Then I glanced at my clock and shot upright. Time felt strange, unsteady. I rushed to the window, looking outside as if expecting to see something different. My heart raced as I caught sight of the street below. Colors appeared more vibrant, there was an energy in the air. I stepped outside, the world felt lighter. I engaged with every passerby, every interaction ignited something within me. I wasn't just living, I was thriving. But then, the eerie feeling of being watched crept back. In the corner of my mind, a voice echoed, "You can change it all, just like that." Time seemed fluid, and suddenly, I grasped that the changes I had made weren't just a routing improvement, they were the beginning of a new narrative, a timeline that rippled with endless possibilities. For weeks, I embraced this newfound energy, stepping into opportunities, embracing risks, and connecting with people I would have previously shied away from. But there was a price, wasn't there? I began to notice subtle shifts, the shadows lengthening, a pervasive sense of anxiety creeping back in, memories resurfacing like ghosts. I realized that in pursuing alternate realities, I had inadvertently fractured my own. Each choice left behind a piece of me, and slowly, night terrors returned, revisiting vivid dreams where that red door remained ajar. I could feel the woman's presence every night, drawing me back towards her, taunting me with possibilities I had yet to experience but had once forsaken. The thrill of the change began to weigh heavily. One night, I found myself at that park again, standing at the same swing set, feeling her gaze from the shadows. "You chose," she whispered, the sound threading through my mind like poison. "But did you choose wisely?" I felt her presence closing in, the fragmented pieces of my former self circling like vultures. "You will pay for every decision, every moment." Just then, the shadows deepened, and I felt like I was back at the precipice of that red door, now more menacing than ever. I could either wade deeper into this altered reality or find a way to reclaim what was mine. Realizing that I couldn't escape the consequences of my choices, I understood then that life is a delicate balance, and for every change made, there is a cost, a threaded path that entwines every facet of existence into an intricate weave of light and darkness. The morning routine that once helped me escape stagnation now felt like an inescapable labyrinth. After that night, I altered my approach. Instead of running towards the changes, I began to embrace them gradually, careful not to lose myself in the process. I focused on grounding myself, on cherishing the present and the relationships I had nurtured. Eventually, the dreams receded, and though the woman remained a part of my memory, I realized she was not a specter of regret to haunt me but a reflection of potential, an echo of every choice I could make. With every dawn that broke, I learned acceptance rather than racing towards what could have been. So, as I sit here telling you this tale, I hope you see that the tale of change is not one of simple choices but a dance, a tightrope of fate where every step you take creates ripples in the tapestry of your life. Be careful how you tread, for every routine is a doorway, each decision a threshold to an uncertain realm, making sure you don't lose yourself in the echoes of what could have been. I survived the journey, only to realize change isn't an end, but a path, with every moment, every choice sculpting the life you mold. But beware, the more fervently you chase the unfamiliar, the more alluring and treacherous the echoes of your own psyche can become. I can't believe I'm posting this, but I feel like I have to share. The past few months have been a whirlwind, and what started as a simple break from life ended up revealing things that weren't meant to be uncovered. It all began when I found myself overwhelmed by the everyday grind. I was weighed down by work, relationships, and expectations. So, I did what anyone would do when they hit rock bottom. I booked a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. The cabin was rustic, isolated, and nestled deep within a forest that seemed to have been untouched for centuries. I arrived late in the afternoon, sunlight trickling through the leaves, casting dancing shadows on the ground. The air was crisp and filled with the sweet scent of pine, and for the first time in months, I felt a flutter of hope. I unpacked my bags, set up a fire pit, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful, rejuvenating weekend. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The once comforting sounds of nature transformed into something more sinister. The rustling of leaves became whispers, and each snap of a twig felt like an omen. I tried to shake off the unease as I sat by the fire, staring into the flames. My mind was racing with thoughts, and maybe I overreacted by isolating myself. But deep down, I felt that this trip would lead to something profound. I just had to weather a few odd occurrences. The first night passed in peculiar calm, but I woke in the middle of the night, drawn to a strange sound outside. It felt like a low hum, almost melodic, calling me into the woods. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside to follow the music. The deeper I went into the forest, the louder the sound became, almost enveloping me. I noticed a faint glow ahead, like moonlight illuminating something extraordinary. As I approached, I stumbled upon a group of what looked like old stones arranged in a circle, and in the center sat a shimmering figure, its translucent form flickering like the flames of my campfire. It was beautiful, and terrifying, with features too vague to describe but enchanting enough to keep me transfixed. The music resonated from it, a hauntingly beautiful tune that struck a chord deep within me. I thought about turning back, but something beckoned me forward, an instinct to understand what I was witnessing. In that moment, the figure looked up and met my gaze. It felt like 1,000 memories crashing into my mind. I was bombarded with images from my life, my childhood, lost friendships, missed opportunities, and things I thought I had forgotten. And then came the clarity, a sudden insight into my life choices and the reasons behind my dissatisfaction. It revealed how I had buried my creativity under the weight of societal expectations, how I conformed to the mold laid out for me without ever questioning whether it fit. I began to sob, overwhelmed by a tide of self-realization, but the figure lifted its hand, silencing my anguish. In a gentle, knowing motion, it began to shift the music, weaving it into a different melody, a hopeful one, full of possibility. It told me that clarity doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes, it's a painful reminder of what we've sacrificed on the altar of normalcy. But within it lies a choice, a chance to redefine everything. As the night wore on, I was entranced by the figure's dance, as if it was guiding me through my past, my regrets, and my dreams. Hours felt like minutes. I knew the sun would rise soon, and I was clinging to the knowledge that I had tried to retreat from my life only to be shown what I truly wanted. When the first rays of dawn touched the treetops, the figure began to fade, and the moment slipped through my fingers like sand. I stumbled back to the cabin, shaken but filled with an electric energy. As the sun arched into the sky, I sat on the steps of the cabin, heart pounding, replaying every detail in my mind. I spent the rest of the day contemplating what I had learned. It wasn't just a mystical experience, it was a prompt to act. I had taken a break, yes, but more importantly, I had found the clarity I needed to reshape my life. That day, I made choices instead of succumbing to the routine. I picked up an old sketchbook and began to fill it, letting my imagination run wild. I reached out to friends I lost touch with, apologized for the silence, and made plans to meet. I enrolled in a pottery class, something I had always wanted to try. But something else lingered on the edges of my mind, a sense of responsibility. I had learned this gift for clarity came at a cost. As I returned to my everyday life, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure I saw wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I had a sense that it was still out there, watching over me. I kept my eyes open for the extraordinary even as the days faded into a blur of routine again. Then came a dark twist. Within a week, I noticed subtle signs of something wrong. Friends would approach me, eyes wide with a terror I couldn't explain. Odd, mundane accidents began happening, lights flickered more frequently, whispers echoed in rooms I was alone in. At first, I brushed them off, thinking I was imagining things. But then I started hearing the music again, our little forest hymn, playing soft and sweet in the dead of night. It was as if that ghostly figure was calling me back, but for what purpose? Was it a warning, or a beckoning to remember the lessons I'd learned? My nights became filled with restless sleep and cold sweats, realizing I had opened a door to something I couldn't quite grasp. I dove deep into research, scouring the internet for folklore, local legends, trying to connect the dots. I learned that ancient spirits are known to carry messages to those in need, and that some people are graced in that way. But there was no hero's tale for those who ignored the signs. It warned that to take is to also give, and as I scrolled through warnings, I felt a weight in my chest. I worried I had taken too much. Then, one night while working late, I received a notification from a local news site. A family had gone missing just a few miles from my cabin, vanishing without a trace. My heart raced, and those whispers returned. What if the figure I encountered had led me to clarity but demanded balance in return? I began writing everything down, not just my experiences but a testament to anyone else seeking the peace of the woods. I shared it on forums, talked to friends, warned them there might be something else out there, lurking just past the veil of clarity. I still feel it watching sometimes. I can hear the hum when loneliness sets in. But I no longer fear it. I honor that experience and stay vigilant. I took a break and found clarity for sure, but I know now that any shift from the mundane carries risks. Whether it's balance or warnings, I don't know. All I can say is, if you seek clarity in the woods, be cautious. You might just find something that reshapes you, or worse, something that demands a price. So here I am, sharing this, hoping someone will read it and heed the warnings. There's magic out there, but it's accompanied by shadows, and not all of them are benevolent. Don't let the song of the woods enchant you without remembering to keep your own voice in the melody.